a number of years ago when I spoke here in Vancouver on a panel of educators. I think it was myself, some of the other Jewish day school heads, kind of like a ringer that was brought in from out of town. And I shared a story about a teacher who was struggling with the behavior of one of the young boys in her class. And it's now about the third week in September, and she decides to reach out to the parent to share a little bit about what's going on and kind of garner the parent's support for helping to encourage this young man's improvement in his behavior. So she picks up the phone and she dials and she says, "Hello, Mrs. Schwartz. You know, it's Mrs. Cohen, Chaim's teacher. I'm sorry to be making this call, but you know, Chaim hasn't been the best behaved child in class, and I wanted to call you to talk to you a little bit about it." And the Mrs. Schwartz like stops her dead in her tracks and says, "Hey, you know, I just had him over the last 2 months home with me all summer long, and I didn't call you every time he acted out," which was of course meant to be a bit of a joke or a humorous way to look at what the relationship should be between school and home. But what's actually very interesting is in the last couple of months, that story is no longer accurate because teachers are getting calls all the time from parents to say, "I've got my kid at home with me and I'm trying to do this homeschooling thing, but I really don't know what I'm doing. So I'd like a little bit of assistance with it." And the reason I wanted to start with this story is because I think current events, the state of global affairs has shined a light on interpersonal relationships in a way that has never been seen in our lifetimes, and the need to maintain proper ben adam lachavero, the commandments between man and his fellow man. We all go out of our way to make sure that in our relationship with God, we're as pious as we can possibly be, but we sometimes come up a little short when we interact with other people, particularly given trying situations. So I found this particular topic to be not just fascinating from an analytical perspective of various passages of the Torah, but a very worthwhile lesson for today. So I want to start off. I believe I'm able to share my screen. I might try and do that here. There we go.
Yes, you should be able to.
So I do have a source sheet. And I'm going to start with a passage from the end of the book of Vayikra. This was the Torah portion from just 2 weeks ago. And we read, or a week and a half ago, we read in Parshat Bahar, which part of the Parsha deals with the laws of tzedakah, of social support systems, for lack of as a great broad term. Social support systems. It talks about when one harvests their field, that they leave certain sections for the poor, various expressions of the mitzvah of tzedakah. And there's one very broad directive. And that is the first source on our page. When your brother becomes poor, and his hand begins to fail, you shall strengthen him. Whether it be a ger, v'tosha, whether it be a stranger or someone you're more familiar with, and he shall live with you. And the very next verse is a familiar commandment, that of offering interest-free loans. And in fact, I believe it is one of the oldest Jewish societies in British Columbia, is the Hebrew Free Loan Society. And many communities have a Hebrew Free Loan Society. And the reason for that is this very verse. It's Al tikach me'ito neshech v'tarbis. You shall not take interest from your friend, and you shall fear your God, and then again repeats this directive of your brother shall live with you. And the commentaries wonder, there are many mitzvot in the Torah, and most of them don't have this sort of dramatic exclamation at the end, you shall fear your God. It comes up from time to time, certainly, but the average mitzvah certainly does not end the sentence with this exclamation about fearing your God. And therefore, the commentators search for a reason of why it is appropriate to have here. And Rashi, the classic commentator, 11th century commentary on Chumash, as well as the Talmud, the Mishnah, offers a fascinating explanation. And I'm going to paraphrase. I'm not going to read it inside because I know that we are on a tight schedule, but it's source 1b, and it's the Rashi on verse 36. It says, why was it necessary to add this exclamation, this emphasis to the verse, not to take interest? Apparently, the Torah, God, who understands us better than we understand ourselves, knows that we have an inclination towards offering loans on interest. We don't want to offer interest-free loans. We prefer to charge interest. Why? Because it's painful to lose out on the potential gain of my money, right? And the words of Rashi are that he's he is bishvil ma'osav. He is concerned about his money, shahi betelos etzlo, which is sitting unproductive for him. Like, if I don't charge interest, then my money's just sitting and it's not earning anything. Could you imagine something more foolish than keeping your money in an account that doesn't offer prime plus 2%? I mean, even when rates are low. And if you understand, if we want to take a moment and reflect on this concept that Rashi is sharing with us and put it in the broader perspective. Your neighbor knocks on the door and he explains that he's just lost his job. He's got creditors knocking. He's a month away from losing his house to the bank. And all he's asking you for, he's not asking for charity, he's not asking for a handout, he's not even asking for a job. All I want is an interest-free loan. I will pay you back. We'll guarantee the loan. Right? If I don't pay you, the guarantor will pay you. This fellow, this potential creditor, lender is going to sit there and say, wait a minute, if I can't lend you money for nothing. I'm not going to earn my 3%, my 4%, my 5%, even if interest rates are 12%. We're not talking about digging into your capital. And by the way, if I approach you to borrow money, presumably you're in a better financial situation than I am. You're not mortgaging your house to offer me a loan. We're talking about people who have liquidity, who have the money sitting around and available, and all I'm asking for is an interest-free loan. Yet the Torah understands that we have this tendency to be so self-centered that we can only focus on, but what is this? This is prime plus 2%. 2%, Rabbi, that I'm losing out on if I should lend you this money interest-free. And in reading this Rashi and considering this level of what seems to me blatant selfishness, I am reminded of a conversation that I had many, many years ago when I was a student in yeshiva, and the Rosh Yeshiva was, as is sometimes the case, veers off the topic of sort of how the Talmud, the discussion of the Talmud, and just kind of waxes eloquent and starts talking about broader philosophical issues. And I don't remember why we went down this path, but my Rosh Yeshiva in Rochester, Rabbi Menachem Davidowitz, said, a baby is the most selfish creature you will ever meet. We all come into this world as babies. All we care about is me, now. If I'm hungry, I want everybody to know that I'm hungry. If I need my diaper changed, nobody rests until I get what I need. I don't care that you've had a tough day at work. I don't care that you just fell asleep. It's 3 o'clock in the morning, and yet all sorts of, it doesn't matter to baby. Baby cares only about himself. And then Rabbi Davidowitz said, the extent to which we mature, the extent to which we grow up, is the extent to which we overcome this exclusively on ourselves, and recognize and empathize and look out for this.
One second, Rabbi. I have to restart your.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you now.
I remember this probably took place a little over 25 years ago. And in the 25 years since then, I've learned one very interesting thing, or I had an interesting observation, is that some people get older, but they don't grow up. And they don't see past this. And they don't learn to appreciate and empathize with the needs of other people. And it is always about me. Now, we are about to enter into the Chag of Shavuot, and not only was this an exceptional point in Jewish history for the revelation, every single member of the Jewish people, 2.5 roughly million, 2.5 to 3 million people, men, women, and children, experienced a level of prophecy that even the prophet Yechezkel ben Buzi did not merit. They literally saw and heard and experienced God's presence. They heard the voice of God, and the unprecedented and never heard, no expression of this since then. Not only was it a grand spiritual occasion, but it was also a rather impressive interpersonal moment. And what I'm referring to is mentioned here in source 2a and 2b, in fact, but it is in the very parsha where we read of the revelation at Sinai. In Parshat Yitro, right in the middle of the book of Shemot, we have the people gathered around the mountain. It's the third day of their preparations. They see the clouds rolling in, the rumbling thunder, the fire, all of the miraculous signs on top of the mountain. And the verse ends with the line, and it's the end of verse 2, pasuk bet, Vayichan sham Yisrael neged hahar. And the people camped at the foot of the mountain, opposite the mountain. And our commentaries are very quick to point out, and I've mentioned it there, I've even used the little excerpt from the Rashi Saperstein edition, translation and elucidation, that the word Vayichan, to camp, is here in the singular term, singular form. Hebrew has masculine and feminine forms. It has, of course, tenses, present, past, future, but it also has singular and plural. And Vayichan is the singular, Vayachanu would be the plural for this context. Yet the Torah refers to 2.5 million people in the singular, and Rashi quotes the famous medrash that tells us that the reason it uses the singular term is because they were encamped ki'ish echad b'lev echad. There was a level of achdut, of unity, that was so significant and so palpable that grammatically it made sense to refer to them in a singular unit. And this was a first in Jewish history. I'm going to share with you a number of examples, and I will grant you they're rather extreme examples, but examples that show that the Jewish people were not always this, to use Rabbi Davidowitz's terminology, were not always this grown up, right? Here we see them with a care and a concern and a compassion and empathy for their fellow Jew, that they felt so connected to one another that they can be referred to as a single unit. But this wasn't always the case. And I'll share an example of this, trying to keep my eye on the clock. I'm going to roll back the Torah a few parshiot, a few chapters to the beginning of the book of Shemot, and I'm going to run through a few years of Jewish history very quickly that we're all familiar with. After Joseph and his brothers come down to Egypt, a few generations go by and we find ourselves enslaved in Egypt. And it is so difficult, it's so hard, we pretty much don't even remember a time when life wasn't this difficult. But our Savior, who we later find as our Savior, Moshe Rabbeinu, Moshe is born, and through an interesting series of events, he ends up being raised in Paro's house. This is another introduction of irony into the Torah. The Torah was the first to use irony in literature, by the way. So the Torah tells us that one day, Moshe goes out to his people, and he sees an Egyptian beating a Jew. And he is very disturbed by this, and he takes matters into his own hands, and he dispatches the Egyptian. And the very next day, he goes out again, and this time the Torah tells us he sees two Jews arguing with each other. And this pains him, and he says, what, like, really? We don't have enough enemies? We have to be our own enemies? No, let's make shalom, let's make peace. We'll get some herring, we'll have a l'chaim, we'll put it all behind us. And one of the individuals turns to him, and this is verse 14, pasuk Yudal, and it says, "Vayomer misamcha leishsar v'shofet aleinu." Who made you the boss of me? Right? Halahargeni ata omer kasher araktas amitzri. You're going to kill me like you killed the Jew, like you killed the Egyptian yesterday. Is that where this is going to go? It was a rather stark pachin panim. It was a backhand across Moshe's face, and Moshe's taken aback. And the Torah testifies is by Yira Moshe. Moshe was very afraid. By Yomer, and he says, Achein noda hadavar. Behold, the matter is known. Now, if we were to understand this verse in its simplest sense, what that means is like the cat's out the bag. Now, word is going to get back to Pharaoh that I killed this Egyptian. My life is in danger. I have to run. And in fact, Moshe does that, have to flee Egypt. He ends up in Midian, where he meets his wife, where he has his 2 sons, and where he is eventually confronted by God at the burning bush and told to return to Egypt. But Rashi quotes a medrash that has a fascinating take on what does it mean, Achein noda hadavar, behold, the matter is known. And Rashi, I'll paraphrase again in the interest of time, says that Moshe wasn't concerned for his own personal safety. He knew he did the right thing. God will look after me. I'll run. If I need to run, I'll run. But what does noda hadavar, behold, the matter is known? Moshe says to himself, I don't understand why it is the Jewish people, my whole life, I would look out the window to the palace and I would see unbelievable hardship amongst the Jewish people. I see them enslaved. I see them being beaten. I see their children, their boys being thrown into the Nile, murdering the infanticide. What did the Jewish people do to deserve to be singled out like this of all the nations for this terrible suffering? But when I see this kind of interpersonal breakdown, when I see the way that Jews behave to one another, now I get it. Of course they're deserving of punishment. If this is the kind of behavior they have towards one another, if this is the lack of concern and compassion they show towards one another, and when I come along, all I want to do is help, I get us pachin panim, now I understand. If it's these kind of people we're talking about, that makes sense to me. And just in terms of intellectual kind of progression and honesty, Moshe was making this observation based on not just the one exchange. Clearly, he's not going to take the example of one individual. He must have had other evidence to support this dramatic statement about the Jewish people. The next source, which is another similar example, I'm not gonna read it inside, but the Torah also tells us just a few verses after this that when the time came for God to redeem the Jewish people from Egypt, he did so only because of his promise to our forefathers. He told Abraham, they'll be slaves for 400 years, then I'm going to take them out. So the time came to take them out, and the Medrash tells us, had it not been for that guarantee, we certainly weren't going to pull ourselves out of the dirt. Our behavior was not becoming. We were not worthy of redemption, and it was only the merit of our forefathers that brought us out of Egypt. So we see that sometime from this I guess it's about a year and a half or so before Matan Torah, before we stood before Sinai as one man with one heart, so connected to one another that the Torah refers to us in the singular term. A year and a half before that, we had no merits. We had no interpersonal connections to say, look, God, we're behaving ourselves. Please take us out of Egypt. But there is a turning point in the story. And I'm going to share, I am admittedly using some poetic license here. There's a lot of history that it takes us from point A to point B. But there is a beautiful idea that I must share that comes from the splitting of the sea and a passage of the Talmud and Shabbat that to me is a bit of a turning point. And although it doesn't necessarily work with our timeline, it does definitely show where a change occurs, and very much a change for the better. So I'm going to give you a little bit of background because it's a passage that is being plucked from the Talmud. It is 133b in Shabbat. It is actually right in the middle of a chapter known as Rebbe Elazar de Mila, because those are the first words, or actually it's the first opinion in the Mishnah. And it is a chapter that is the primary source in the Talmud for the laws of Brit Milah, of circumcision. So as you can imagine, I've read it once or twice, and always enjoyed this particular idea, which is not really that relevant to the mitzvah of Brit Milah. It's a bit of a tangent from the mitzvah of Brit Milah. We talk about the idea of hidur mitzvah, beautification of a mitzvah, and that is sort of how the Talmud gets onto this tangent. And it says the following: at the splitting of the Red Sea, there was this epiphany moment. The Jewish people saw the Egyptians in the sea, and they launched into song, right? This just out of nowhere, they sang this song of praise. And within the song is a rather interesting term. It says, Zekeli ve'anvehu. This is my God, Zekeli. And then it says the word ve'anvehu. Ve'anvehu is a word that is difficult to translate. It's not easily identified for its roots or its meaning in this context. And it is actually a Tanaic dispute as to how to understand the word ve'anvehu and how the letters of the word mean this. So according to one opinion in a Brisa, which is a Mishnaic text, it says, this is my God, and I will beautify him. We already know the punchlines, so we can translate it as beautify him. I will beautify myself in my performance of the commandments. And the Talmud gives some examples. A selafon of sukkah no'eh. I'll make sure that my sukkah, for Sukkot, when I build the sukkah, it's a mitzvah to build a sukkah. I'm going to build the most beautiful sukkah I can possibly build. I'm going to decorate it. The idea of hanging decorations in the sukkah. 2 minutes. Is that my 2-minute warning? Okay, we're going to talk really fast. The idea of a beautiful sukkah, a beautiful lulav, a beautiful shofar, beautiful tzitzit, and so on. Along comes a different opinion. Abba Shaul says, and how does the word ve'anvehu imply beautify? From the word no'oi, which means beauty. Abba Shaul disagrees, and he says, ve'anvehu habidomalo. I am going to be similar to God. Mahu chanam barachim, as he is gracious, afata chanam barachim, so too should you be gracious, should you be compassionate. I am going to follow in his way. And Rashi says, you know how the word ve'anvehu means that? It's an anagram of the letters for the words ani vehu, I and he. As God is, so shall I be. But the Maharsha, a later commentator on the Talmud, offers a beautiful interpretation. He says, no, Abba Shaul agrees with the first opinion. We're both using the translation of the word ve'anvehu to mean beautify. But Abba Shaul says, not only do you have to beautify your mitzvot between you and God, not only do you need a beautiful shofar, not only do you need a beautiful sukkah, not only do you need beautiful tzitzit, you also need beautiful acts of chesed. You need beautiful acts of charity, of tzedakah. It is the beautification of the mitzvot, ben adam l'chavero, those interpersonal mitzvot, that is what we achieved here at the sea. And I'm not going to have time, unfortunately, to really dive into, pardon the pun, what the experience at the sea did to perhaps cause this, but it was an epiphany and an understanding of God's love for us, the extent to which he exacted retribution, kechut hasara, as precise as a hair's breadth against the Egyptians, that helped us to realize what our obligation is, not just to God, but to our obligation to other people. So we find ourselves, as I started with, in a time where our interpersonal connections, because of our physical distance, are more important than ever before. The need to be there and to support people socially and emotionally is a greater need than we will ever find in our lives. And as I know, Rabbi, I'm 30 seconds over time. I'm going to take 30 more seconds just to close. As I've shared with a number of people that I've had conversations with since the beginning, in the middle of March, eventually the economy will recover. Eventually, health will improve. We'll find a vaccine, whatever it's going to be. It is the impact, the social and emotional impact of this experience that is going to be the longest lasting. And it's up to us to decide if it's going to be a long-lasting negative impact, because when our children or those around us look to us to understand how they need to respond in a crisis, and we were not the best example of how to respond in a crisis, that is a lesson that will not soon be forgotten. But on the flip side, if we are zekeli vanvehu, if we beautify our mitzvot, if we take particular care and attention to the interpersonal relationships and the way that we support each other socially and emotionally, that is the strongest lesson that we can take away. More than any remote math, language arts, Talmud, or Chumash, is the fact that we are there for one another, and when the going gets tough, the tough look after one another. And that to me is the message of the sea, and hopefully one that takes you into Shavuot.
Rabbi Pach, thank you so much. We really appreciate your
Cool.
teaching, not just in this context, but in so many others. Oh, good. I was going to ask you to end your screen share. So I am very, very happy that there are a lot of hidden blessings of this new situation. One of which is that we can collapse the globe. And there's one person here who has been who is already starting the all-night activity, because for her it is nighttime. She is in Toronto. Leslie Sullivan is a bat bait of Sharet Tzedek. Her, if I'm getting this correctly, her grandfather was the Gabbai. And if you look at the Aron Kodesh that is in our Beit Midrash, that was dedicated to her, I think, her great-grandparents. And so she is also quite an accomplished Torah teacher and Torah scholar. The rabbis in her hometown of Toronto sing her wonderful praises, and it gives us the opportunity to bring a Sharet Tzedek, I guess, progeny back here to our doors. And so it is with great pleasure that I ask Leslie Sullivan to share with us. Rebbetzin Leslie Sullivan, who's going to be speaking on "The World May Be Changing, but the Torah Remains Constant."
Okay, thank you very much. Rishos Harabanim and Shavach Hashem, thank you so much. It's really, for me, it's very, very meaningful. Yes, my grandfather, Yitzhak ben Peretz Levi. So I wanted to say all these Divrei Torah are a compilation of listening to Rabbi Rosner and Rabbi J.J. Schechter. So the lessons of Shavuos are as relevant today as they were when we got the Torah 3,000 years ago. So I'm going to turn to none other than Mark Twain, his essay called Concerning the Jews, which really drives home this message to me. He says, I'm going to quote it, "If the statistics are right, the Jew constitutes but 1/4% of the human race. Properly, the Jew ought hardly to be heard of, but he is heard of, has always been heard of. He is as prominent on the planet as any other people, and his importance is extravagantly out of proportion to the smallness of his bulk. His contributions to the world, list of great names in literature, science, art, music, finance, medicine, are also out of proportion to the weakness of his numbers. The Egyptians, the Babylonians, the Persians, they filled the planet, and they are a faded dream. The Jews saw them all, beat them all, and is now what he always exhibits: no weakening on his part, no slowing energies, no dulling his alertness. All things are mortal but the Jew. What is the secret of his immortality?" So I'll tell you, Mark Twain, what the secret of our immortality is. It's the world does change and nations do come and go. The Jews are eternal. Why? What makes us eternal? It's our faith in Hashem and the Torah. So I would like to share with you briefly some eternal messages of Shavuos that I have gleaned over the years. So, Rabbi Pak, thank you. You introduced the pasuk Vayichan Sham Yisrael Neged Har, which is a very popular pasuk. They're all pasukim are important, but this is a very popular pasuk during this time period. And like you said, Rashi quotes Ki ish echad kelev echad, right? One person, one heart. So what is so significant about this pasuk? Why do we really care about where they camped and that it was singular? What is it telling us? So the Ksaf Sofer quotes a beautiful Gemara in Shabbos 31, and it's one that we all have heard of. It's about Hillel and the famous convert that comes to him and says to him, "Teach me the entire Torah on one foot." And teach me the Torah on one foot. And Hillel does respond, and he says, "Don't do unto others what you would not want done to yourself." Really, it's the inverse of saying, "V'ahavta l'reacha kamocha," love your neighbor like yourself. So really, what is the convert asking? Is he asking to teach me the Torah on one foot? And how is Hillel's response? How does that response really satisfy him? So What the Ger was really getting down to is he sees there are 613 mitzvos, and he thinks to himself, if I'm going to become a Jew, how can I fulfill all 613 mitzvos? And it's even impossible when you look at it on the surface level, because there's some mitzvos that apply only to Kohanim, priests, some to Leviim, some to kings. There are numerous psukim that not everybody can do. So how can I fulfill them? So what does Hillel respond? He responds right back to that pasuk that says, Ki ish echad kelev echad, like one man, like one heart. You're right. As an individual, you cannot fulfill all the mitzvahs. But when we work together, when we're an am echad, when we're a unit, then we can fulfill all the mitzvahs. And that's what he's saying. He's saying, if you love your neighbor like yourself, if you feel for him like you feel for yourself, if you become one with your neighbor, then we can all fulfill the Torah. And that's what he was answering him. And it's a beautiful, we know the Baruch Shomer tells us that the Torah is referred to as a shira. Va'ata tisfu lachem es hashira hazos, it says in Devarim. And write for me the shira. It's a shira, a song, a symphony. Why is the Torah referred to as symphony? Because, in a symphony, you have different instruments. And each instrument on its own might not be so wonderful. But when you put the instruments together, the harmony, the pitches, it's so beautiful. And that's what the Torah is. One, we put everybody together and we make beautiful music together. So now we understand that unity is a key component to receiving the Torah. But how do we get to be unified? So the Shem Mishmuel, he also looks at the same pasuk, Vayichan Sham Yisrael, and he focuses on Neged Hahar, next to the mountain. And why do we care that they were next to this mountain? What's so important about this mountain, right? So the Megillah 39a tells us that when God said, I'm going to give the Torah on a mountain, all the mountains in the world fought over it. And you know what? There were more beautiful, more spectacular mountains than Har Sinai. So why didn't God choose those mountains? He chose Har Sinai, which was a modest little mountain. And why? Because humility. Because humility is a prerequisite in order to have unity. Because an arrogant person only sees the world through his own lenses. I'm the center of the universe. And as we know, the more room we take up for ourselves, the less room for God and for others. So God needed to have this aura of humility permeate Har Sinai so that they would understand humility. But the Shem Mishmuel goes even one step further. He says, well, if you're looking for humility, then I think you should really have it in a valley, because that would be you would really reflect humility. But he says, you know what? No, that would not be a good answer, because you need a mountain. You need to be slightly raised up. You need to understand that there's something called humility and there's something called self-worth. Because if you thought of yourself as only low, it would be a recipe for disaster. You would be depressed. You would be uninspired. So true humility is really a balance between self-worth and self-awareness. So how do we find this right balance? We only have to look further than Avram Avinu, the first Av. And we all know, Rav Soloveitchik tells us about the famous saying, Anochi Afar ve'Afar. I am just dust and earth, right? But Rav Soloveitchik so beautifully points out, and he tells us that you have to look at the beginning of the pasuk too. And you know what the beginning of the pasuk says? It says, God says, I have just begun to speak to my master, although I am just ashes. What is he saying? That even though I'm ashes, but I realize I can have an audience with God. On one hand, I'm dust and earth, but on the other hand, I am here in the presence of God. I'm balancing it. And that's so important. And Rav Yerucham Levovitz said to his students, he was the mashgiach of the Mir Yeshiva, and he would say to his students, it's tragic when you don't recognize your faults. But you know what's even more tragic? When you do not recognize your strengths. So we have to have self-awareness and self-humility. And that's maybe what Rav Simcha Bunim said to us, we have two pockets, and we have to have two things, one saying in each pocket. In one pocket, we have to say, Bishvili Nivra Ha'olam, the Gemara in Sanhedrin 37b. For me, the world was created. We have to realize that the world was created for me. And in the other pocket, Anochi V'afer, what Abraham said. So we have to have that combination, right? And the Rav says so beautifully, people erroneously think self-worth and self-confidence is the antithesis of humility. It's exactly the opposite. You need the both. You need to combine the both. And you need to know that Hashem believes in you. And you know how important that is, that Hashem believes in you, so that you realize your importance, your significance. The very first words when we wake up in the morning are Modeh, we thank, right? To be a Jew is to thank, right? Of course. But then we end it with Rabbah Emuna Techa. You have much faith in me. God has faith in me. Every single one of us has a purpose. Every single one of us is important, and God has faith in us. That was all last week's parsha. Rabbi Jonathan Sachs talks about the counting, how important it was to count, because when you count, it shows you love something. God loves us. He believes in us. And maybe if I'll just, people make a strong connection between Pesach and Shavuot, and really they say these 49 days that we're going through is really a Chol HaMoed from Pesach to Shavuos, because Shavuos is called an Etzeres, another name. And there's a question, we always read the Dayenu, and we say it would have been enough if God would have just given us Har Sinai, and that would have been enough and no Torah. What do you mean? How can we say that? We needed the Torah. No, but we needed the lesson of Har Sinai, the lesson of humility, which will lead us, which will breed us to Achdus. And that's the powerful message. So now that we've established that you need humility and that we need unity in order for Matan Torah, let's just briefly explore our relationship with God. So there's another pasuk that's often quoted during this time period, and it's that the Jews stood underneath the mountain. Shmos 19:7, right? They stood underneath the mountain. So there's that famous Gemara that Rashi quotes in Shabbos 88b that says, Hashem put them next to the mountain, and what he did is kafar alem har kagigas. He overturned the mountain on them like a barrel. And he said, if you accept the Torah, great, fine, good, I love it. But if not, there, and there is a very powerful word, we're not going to get into it, there will be your burial. So what's happening here? What is God saying to us? God is saying to us, you know what? We have to realize that we are Avdei Elokim. We are God's servants. We have to have an element of yira, but when I say yira, awness, not fear, but in awe. We have to be in awe, and we have to recognize we are God's servant. But I want to discuss something. We know the very famous statement, Naaseh v'nishma, which is not found in Yitro, Parshas Mishpatim, and just by the way, it's the 24th parak, the 7th pasuk, which is kind of cute, 24/7. You should be learning Torah 24/7. Anyway, so Naaseh v'nishma, that's a beautiful saying. That's mean I'll do whatever you say. I'm going to do, and then I'll listen. So how do we connect that, right? I want to embrace the Torah on Shavuos. I want to feel like I have a loving relationship, feeling like a mountain over my head. That's not really an idea I want to conjure up. So comes along Rabbi J.J. Schachter, and he brings a beautiful Mechilta to Rabbi Eliezer, to Rabbi Yishmael. And he quotes the pasuk in Shir HaShirim about a dove that's flying away. It needs shelter, and it goes into the cleft of the rock, so it will find shelter. And he says, think about this. When did the Jews get the Torah? It was in the desert, and it was the middle of the summer. It was so hot. We just had a burning, scorching day here. And you couldn't even stand outside. So can you imagine? You've got over 600,000 men. You've got 2.5 million people standing out in the scorching summer. And what does Hashem do? Hashem takes a mountain and puts it over our head as a shade, as a comfort, as a protection. I don't want you out there feeling hot and not being able to focus. I'm going to comfort you. I'm going to protect you. And that's what we have to realize, that the Torah is there to comfort us, to protect us. And I want to just quote the beautiful Menachem Sion, who is the father of Abe Sachs. And he says a beautiful idea. He says, Im b'chukosai telechu ves mitzvosai tishmaru. If you follow my ways, then you will keep my mitzvos. And he plays on the word b'chukosai, the laws. Those are the laws that we don't understand. You know, we have a lot of laws like don't murder, don't steal. Those all make sense. But what about the laws like shotness, don't wear wool and linen together? We don't really understand those laws. Maybe they're archaic. Maybe we don't need them now. No, the Torah is perfect. And it's precisely those, even those laws that you don't understand, those are the laws that will protect you. I speak about it often. My niece, she's a pharmacist. And you know, if she gets a prescription, and if she makes one deviation in any of those chemicals and gives it to the patient, gives it to the person, it could be, it might not work, or it could even be lethal, right? You don't understand the makeup, but she's got to follow that recipe. And if she doesn't, it's not going to work, right? So that's what we have to understand, that the laws, all 613 laws are relevant and are meaningful to us today. And so I want to say that, you know, we always refer to after the holiday as Isru Chag, right? And it's in Tehillim. We're going to say it in Hallel. And what does Isru? It's the day after Shavuot. It's the day after Sukkot. What does Isru mean? It means to bind, to hold over. And what is Isru Chag all about? It's telling us that it's not just about the holiday. It's not just about going to the Beis Hamikdash and being inspired. It's about bringing home the Beis Hamikdash to your everyday life. And the Imre Emrys tells us that, you know, before the people were going to leave, after they, you know, everybody made a pilgrimage to the temple, they would hold out the shtei halechem, the showbread. And you know what? They would hold out that bread. It was a week old and it was piping hot. It was steaming. Why, of all the miracles that happened in the Beis Hamikdash, why did they specifically choose this to show the steaming hot bread, to show them that just like you're on fire now, when you go home, when you go back to your houses, take the messages of the Shavuos, of the Sukkot, of the Pesach, take them back home with you. And Rav Shlomo even, he also highlights this idea from a pasuk in Shir HaShirim where he says, how lovely are your footsteps, how lovely are your shoes when you come back to, when you come to the Beis Hamikdash. Well, we know that when you're in the Beis Hamikdash, you can't wear shoes. So why is he referring to shoes? Shoes shouldn't be mentioned. Yeah, because he's not talking about when you're in the Beis Hamikdash. He's talking about when you go home. And that's the whole purpose, is all this learning that you're doing tonight. It's incredible and it's going to inspire you. But the important thing is take all these moments, internalize them, and bring them back to you. So let's just summarize. We talked about Mark Twain, who taught us about the eternity of the Jew. And it's because of our steadfast belief and commitment to God and Torah. And we understand that we need unity. We need unity, like one man, like one heart. And in order to get that unity, we need humility. We need to recognize, and it's a combination. Humility means self-worth and self-awareness. Those two are very, very important. And then we have to realize our relationship with God. That's so important. We talked about the interpersonal. We talked about our relationship with God. And we talked about, yes, we are Avdei Elohim. We are servants of God, and what God says goes. You're right. There's an awe there. But we also have to recognize the Torah is a canopy, and it is a protection, and God has made it so it will protect us. It will make us comfortable. It will make our lives meaningful. And as we've learned all these lessons, the Isru Chag, we take it home with us, just like the Shtei Alechem was piping hot a week later, and just like we walked home with our shoes. And finally, my last thought is the Kli Yakar, who so brilliantly points out when he looks at their Shavuos is called several names, but never in the Torah is it called Matan Torah. It's not called the holiday of the giving of the Torah. Why? Because he wants us to know that every day should be like a Matan Torah. Every day you should feel like you got the Torah, like it's new. And as Rav Pinchas says, life is a train ride, and each Yom Tov is a different station. And we need to get off at that station. We're going to get off at the station of Shavuos, and we're going to have a spiritual recharge. We're going to take all these internal lessons that you're learning. Thank you, Rabbi Rosenblatt, for arranging this. It's a beautiful idea. And we're going to take all these lessons, we're going to internalize it, and we're going to take it through us, and it'll lead us right up until Sukkot. So thank you so much. And I hope we should all be together in Yerushalayim and celebrate Shavuos together. Thank you. Thank you.
Rabbi, you're on mute.
Oh, Leslie, thank you so much for staying up late, for sharing the Torah with us, with all the passion, the resources, the scholarship that you bring to it. It's really a special thing for us to be able to see the generations of Shaare Tzedek around the globe. Hopefully, also we want to extend our brachot to you and to the entire Toronto community, that you should be safe, and that the virus should soon, te'atzer hamagefa, as they say, that it should be come to a quick end in Toronto and across Canada. Thank you so much.
Thank
you. So I think I'm having a little trouble getting our next speaker on. So Rabbi Gabai is going to give us a short little piece on Sephardic customs on Shavuot, because I don't think cheesecake is native to Morocco.
Wow, put me on the spot. Thank you, Rabbi. So Sephardic customs in general really are very unique in that we Sephardim have a very, very strong emphasis on the Tikkun Lil Shavuot. Kabbalistically, which I'll be speaking a little bit about later.
We can. But we don't have he's muted.
Yeah, because I did this.
We Sephardim are very, very, put a great emphasis on the fact that we, through the night, make sure to read the different parts and different sections of the Torah. We go through the Tanakh, Torah shebichtav, usually read 3 pesukim of the whole Torah, the first 3 pesukim of the parasha and the last 3 pesukim of the parasha. We go through the entire Torah, other than some major parashiot, which obviously talk about something like Matan Torah and Parshat Yitro and Parshat V'etchana. Rabbi, we're on?
Yeah, actually, it's one of those peculiarities. But thank God we do have Rabbi Yitz Et Shalom. Rabbi Et Shalom is a really a very accomplished teacher and author. Has written books on Tanakh. Is also a graduate of my yeshiva, of Yeshivat Har Etzion. He runs a Beit Midrash in Los Angeles that's connected to the Young Israel of Century City. He's also just a real, one of my members has said that he's one of the great minds that everyone should hear. And so I'm glad that this gives us the opportunity to have some time with Rabbi Yitzchak Et Shalom. And Rabbi Et Shalom is speaking on the topic of Megillat Ruth, the passage from tribal living under the Shoftim to the united monarchy under Shmuel. Thank you, Rabbi Et Shalom.
Thank you, Rabbi Rosenblatt. One of the favorite midrashim that we like to quote around this time of year is based on the pasuk at the very beginning of the narrative of Matan Torah, which is Vayichan Sham Yisrael Neged Ahar, and the famous comment of the midrash that Rashi quotes. Vayichan, that they encamped, is presented in the singular, and the idea is Ki Ish Echad B'Lev Echad. And it kind of sets the tone. And by the way, the rest of Rashi's comment is one that doesn't go on the posters, which is as opposed to every other time they camped when they were quarreling. But the statement sets a tone for the image of Am Yisrael the way that we keep it. If you were to ask, what is a defining feature of Am Yisrael, and perhaps as this song that was just written by Lenny Solomon and was circulated and a bunch of rabbis participated in, is Miki Amcha Yisrael, Goy Echad Ba'aretz. The Gemara famously says that HaKadosh Baruch Hu has a symbiotic relationship with us, where he says, Atem asituni chativa achat ba'olam, you have declared me to be one in the world, Shema Yisrael Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad, and therefore, Vani aseh etchem chativa achat ba'olam, I will make you a singular, unified piece in this world. Shenemar Miki Amcha Yisrael Goy Echad Ba'aretz. It's actually a quote of David, and we're going to come back to David. And so, of course, the idea of a united nation and a single nation is something that we see as being the only model. And not only that, but we see as one of the greatest tragedies in our history, the divide of the nation in Shechem, when Rechavam came to be crowned and when He refused the tax request, and as a result, almost the entire nation said, we're done with the monarchy, and they stepped away, and ultimately ended up naming somebody from Shevet Ephraim by the name of Yoravam as their king, and there was a separated kingdom. The kingdoms never united. And we see that as a tragic aberration of what our mission is. However, if we look very carefully at our history from the Torah through really the middle of Sefer Shmuel, we'll see that that is not necessarily the case. I'll begin with a pasuk that we're all familiar with from the other Torah fest. We have the Torah fest of Shavuot, and of course we have the Torah fest of Simchat Torah. And Simchat Torah, we read the end of the Torah, Zot HaBracha, and in it there is a line that Moshe uses in his introduction to the blessings, where he says, Af chovev amim kol kadoshav biyadecha. God loves the nations, and all of the holy ones are in his hand. And the Midrash Halacha, and that pasuk says, who are the Amim? The Amim are the tribes. And if you take a look at the way that we are presented both in the Torah, from the beginning of Sefer Shemot, all the way to the end, and all the way up until the beginning of Sefer Shmuel, it is inaccurate to refer to us as a single united nation. Lehefech, we are really 12 nations, perhaps 11, perhaps 13, depends how you count, depends who was aligned with whom. But the unity that we read about in this past week's parasha in Bamidbar, and continue to read about through Sefer Bamidbar, is a unity that's born of an exigent circumstance. We are now marching in order to go to war. And therefore we're set up as an army camp, 4 different army camps with the Mishkan in the middle, and the army camps are comprised of 3 tribes on each side, which have their own system, their own leadership, their own names, their own flags, etc. And they're grouped together for purposes of military balance, parity, whatever other strategies there may be, and they're going to march into the land. What is the plan when they get into the land? The plan is that they go into the land and they're going to conquer and all fight together for the entire land. And once that happens, then they're going to each go their own separate way. And that's exactly what happens at the end of Sefer Yoshua. When Yoshua gives us farewell to the people in Shechem, very famous passage we all remember from the Haggadah, Avraham, etc. He gives the entire historiosophy leading up to that moment, and then he challenges the people to commit to being loyal to Hashem. They commit, they attest to their commitment, he writes it down, and then he sends them home. And what's home? Home means Yehuda goes to Hebron, and Zvulun goes to Yokneam, and Asher goes to somewhere near Beirut, and Yisachar goes to Har Tavor, or Zvulun goes to Har Tavor, and Yisachar goes to Jenin. Everybody goes to their own place. And we might think, well, that's not the way it's supposed to be, but if you look in Sefer Devarim, you will see that is the way it's supposed to be. In Sefer Devarim, what's set up is 2 models. A model which is temporary, which is for war, in which we're all united, and a model which is permanent, which is tribal. And perhaps the easiest place to look at it is the very opening of Sefer Shoftim, Parshat Shoftim. In Parshat Shoftim, we're told, Shoftim v'shoterim titen lecha v'chol sha'arecha asher Adonai Elohecha noten lecha mishvatecha. You are to put judges and officers in the gates of your tribes. And indeed, I'm not sure how many of the crowd here was involved in Daf Yomi in the last cycle, but in Masechet Horayot, which is not only a favorite of Daf Yomi people because it's less than 2 weeks in Daf Yomi, but it's also a favorite of a lot of people who like to make a very quick siyum because it's all of 12 daf. Masechet Horayot, which speaks about a judicial error, a legislative error, which the court produces and leads people astray, and what the consequences of that are. Much of the information is devoted to the central Beit Din of each shevet, the central Beit Din of each tribe operating independently. And the model that seems to appear from the presentation in Dvarim is that you should live tribally. Each tribe has its own government. Each tribe has its own officers. Each tribe has its own system. And by the way, each tribe has its own, not only territory, but its own customs and its own dialect even. And there is even an image that we can see, and we'll get to it in a minute in Sefer Shoftim, that ideally tribes intramarry, meaning somebody from Dan should marry a girl from Dan. That's the example I'll get to. And then the federation between the tribes plays out in two very critical ways. The first one is mutual assistance, which means that we trade with each other, and in war we help defend each other, we come to each other's aid. And of course, we have a common worship site in the middle, which sits first in the area of Ephraim and then the area of Binyamin. And that is the place that we make our pilgrimage to do korbanot. But otherwise, we live tribally. And that seems to be the model at the end of Sefer Yoshua. And the entire book of Shoftim is about tribal living. However, there's an interesting thing that happens. Tribal living is an experiment that fails miserably. You read Sefer Shoftim from the beginning to the end, and what you read about is an attempt to create a federation, a very loose federation, of what amounts really to about 5 tribes, because the rest of them really don't play a role in Sefer Shoftim, and for them to work together, to cooperate, but to be living independently, and clearly without any sort of united government, without any united leadership. And it's perhaps best epitomized by what Gidon, who was perhaps the most successful of the leaders during that period, says after his great victory over the Midianites, when the people say to him, Mishol Banu, Gamata Gam Bincha, we want you to be our leader and your son, which means create a dynasty. And he says, Lo imshol ani bachem, v'lo yimshol b'ni bachem, I will not rule over you, neither will my son. Adonai yimshol bachem, God is the one who should rule over you. And that seems to be the ideal. So there's no united government, and there is no monarchy, and there is no dynasty. And leadership is essentially dynamic, because when there's a need for a leader, as we see in Shoftim Perek Bet, God raises a leader, the leader leads a battle to overthrow the oppressor, and then things quiet down again. That seems to be the model. This model, as I said, is an abject failure. Sefer Shoftim is a book of a cycle, and the cycle of Shoftim is that the people sin, typically because they do exactly what they were told in Sefer Devarim not to do, which is to interact with the local people who they did not get out of the land, to intermarry with them, to join them, to make covenants with them, and as a result of that, to join their worship of the Baal. And therefore, God sends an oppressor, whether it's Eglon or Kushan Rishatayim or Midian, whoever it is, sends an oppressor to oppress them. They're oppressed for a while, 10 years, 18 years, however long it is. They call out to God. God raises a military leader, a guerrilla leader, as it were, from among them. That's what we call a shofet. By the way, nobody in Shoftim, with the possible exception of Dvorah, does any judging. They're all military leaders. So judges is kind of a bad translation for Shoftim. And that person leads an uprising, a successful uprising, overthrows the oppressor, and then things go back to where they were. But take a look at what happens in Sefer Shoftim. So for instance, in Sefer Shoftim, there is a battle, the battle that we're familiar with. We read about it on Shabbat Shirah and Shabbat Shalach. It is the battle against Sisera. Dvorah has the beautiful song, and in the beautiful song, what does she do? She counts all of the different tribes that did come to help, and she praises them. And then she lists all the tribes who didn't come to help because they were too afraid of upsetting their rulers, or because they were having a good time on the other side of the river, whatever it was, and they didn't want to come and help, and she curses them. We even have a point in Sefer Shoftim where the tribe of Menashe leads a successful uprising against the oppressor, against Ammon. And Ephraim, remember Ephraim, Menashe, Ephraim comes and challenges him, saying, why didn't you let us join you in the battle? And it leads to a civil war in which, according to the text, 42,000 members of Ephraim are slaughtered in one day by Menashe. That's what's happening in Sefer Shoftim. And there's an anthem that shows up at the end of Sefer Shoftim. It shows up 4 times at the end. The Shoftim tells 2 grievous stories at the end, which didn't happen at the end of the period. They happened earlier, but it's put at the end because it's really the epilogue of Shoftim to lead us to Shmuel. And the anthem of those stories is, Vayamim Mahem Ein Melech BiYisrael Ish Hayashar Be'einav Ya'aseh. In those days, there was no king. Everybody was doing whatever was right in their own eyes. And that was seen as terrible. And when you finish Sefer Shoftim with the terrible massacre, the one time that Am Yisrael comes together in Sefer Shoftim is to go to war against Shevet Binyamin and nearly decimate Shevet Binyamin, where only 600 men are left of the Shevet, and from them we have to reconstitute the tribe. It's a terrible, terrible image. And so the sense that we get coming out of that book is there's a cry for a united government. There's a cry for a king. There's a cry for a single leader. Turn the page to Sefer Shmuel, and you can already anticipate that we're going to be moving into a different era. And indeed, the very beginning of Shmuel, which doesn't speak about a king at all, has the famous story, which we're all familiar with, of Hannah. And Hannah, after she's blessed with a child, with Shmuel, and she brings Shmuel a couple of years later and hands him over to become a ward of the Mishkan, she says a tefillah of thanksgiving. And in the last pasuk of that tefillah, she says God will protect his king and his anointed one. And there's already a sense that we're moving towards that kind of peace. So the interesting thing is that in the seams between Shoftim and Shmuel, between the era of tribal living, which was an ideal that didn't work, and the united monarchy, which was an ideal that also didn't work after 2 generations, or after a generation and a half. But it was an ideal, and an ideal that we still talk about returning to. Again, our model is Mi K'amcha Yisrael Goy Echad Ba'aretz. David's words. Our model is a united nation. In the middle of that is Megillat Ruth. And Megillat Ruth is presented as being Bimei Shvot HaShoftim. The story is set as taking place during the period of the Shoftim. And the interesting thing is that Ruth is, I don't know how many of you remember cameras with film in it. That's a long time ago. But remember film, and remember negatives? This goes way back. Okay, thank you, Rabbi, for the thumbs up. But this goes way back. You take a look at a negative, what are you seeing? You're seeing the inversion of the picture. Megillat Ruth is the negative of Shoftim, and really, Shoftim is the negative of Ruth. Shoftim focuses on tribes, not on families. A couple family stories, mainly on tribes. Ruth is a story about a family. Shoftim, almost everybody playing around there, especially in the last 2 stories, is doing bad stuff. In Megillat Ruth, there are no bad people. In Megillat Ruth, there are good people, there are great people, and then there are unbelievably exemplary people. Everybody's a good person in Ruth. We don't know. Maybe Machlon and Kilion, maybe not. We don't know. Maybe Elimelech. Or Pa is a good person. Or Pa in the text is a very good person. She follows Naomi. She's loyal to Naomi. She wants to stay with Naomi. But she accepts Naomi's second push away and leaves. Ruth, on the other hand, is unbelievably great. She's beyond. When we come to the men, Ploni Almoni, whose name doesn't make it into the text, we know him as John Doe. Ploni Almoni, or John Hancock maybe, except he wouldn't sign, is a good guy. He's willing to redeem the field, but he's not Boaz, who's amazing. So everybody's good in this. There are numerous other differences between Shoftim and Ruth, but the key one is that Ruth has an overwhelming lesson. The Midrash on Ruth says that Megillah zu lo ba'alo l'lamed tum'ah v'lo tahara. This Megillah is not teaching us laws, although there are a number of laws that we learn about leket and about yibum, etc. But not there to teach laws, is to teach the great reward for people who do chesed. It's all about chesed, something that is essentially missing in Sefer Shoftim. And so what we hear is something very powerful. In a bleak period, which we can all relate to, in a bleak period where from the outside, from the public eye, things seem to be going in a negative direction. I'm being very kind about it. Things seem to be diminishing. Things seem to be winding away. There's one person who through an unbelievable, extraordinary act of self-sacrifice and kindness reconstitutes a family, just a family, just a single family with the birth of a single child. And within 2 generations, that child's grandson ends up being the single unifying force among the Jewish people forever. Rabbi Yehuda Nasi coined a phrase that we say till this very day. In Masachet Rosh Hashanah, David Melech Yisrael Chai V'Kayam. And David indeed is very much alive. Think about how we talk about Mashiach. We just had Rosh Chodesh. We're going to have Yom Tov coming up tomorrow night. We're going to say Ya'aleh V'Yavo in Tfilah and Birkat HaMazon. And who would he mention? Zichron Mashiach ben David Avdecha. Now that's a reference to the future Mashiach, or reference to Shlomo. Either way, it's David, always at the center. And it all happens because one person takes it upon themselves to do an extraordinary act of kindness, to do her part, and look at the great results. I want to show you something that the author, that Shmuel Hanavi, according to tradition, is the author of Megillat Ruth, although there's clearly a pasuk, at least one pasuk, that's added much later. Take a look at Perek Dalet, pasuk Zion. But he's the author of Megillat Ruth, seemed to structure Megillat Ruth in a way that actually speaks to this exact issue. I want to bring something up on the screen and show you. This is courtesy of David Nativ, and a little background for this because it's something that hits all of us, I think. As you know, when somebody that we love, somebody that we care about passes away, we want to do something to remember them. In Israel, we have unfortunately, a tradition that we've had to engage in too often, which is when somebody young passes away, especially when somebody young passes away defending our land and our country. And often what happens if the person is involved in the world of learning Torah is that what his friends and teachers will do, or her friends and teachers will do, is to put together a book, a sefer, of articles on a topic that the person who passed away loved. So I happened to be in a Sfarim store and found a sefer. I had no idea who it was, a sefer that was written in memory of a chayal who loved Megillat Ruth. And I thumbed through and I saw that a number of the articles were written by some of my teachers. So I figured, okay, and I bought it. And I looked through and I found that one of my teachers, David Nativ, had written a very short article in which he highlighted the idea that Megillat Ruth, in its structure, really speaks to the move from a diffused tribal existence to a unified monarchy. Take a look at this chart. The chart is mine, but it replicates more or less what he taught. If you look at chapter 1 of Megillat Ruth, which we'll all listen to on Shabbat morning, or in Israel on Friday morning, chapter 1 covers at least 15 years. It may be longer, because there's a famine, then the family leaves, then Elimelech dies, then his sons get married, they're married for 10 years, they die, and then afterwards the famine is over, Naomi gets to leave. So it's maybe 12 years, well over 10 years for sure. The distance covered in chapter 1 is the distance from Beit Lechem to Moab and back, a distance that may be 100 miles all told, but it's a distance. If you take a look at chapter 2 takes place over the course of 3 months. 3 months because it starts at the beginning of the barley harvest, which is in, shall we say, early April or late March, and ends at the end of the wheat harvest, which is at the end of June, more or less. So it's basically the spring, 3 months. And it all takes place, with 2 exceptions, in one field, one very large field where Naomi's working. So the space and time have become narrower. Chapter 3, which is a chapter that has a lot of interesting issues with it, is Ruth coming up to Boaz on the threshing floor and basically spending the night, although not spending the night. Read it, you'll see what I mean. It all takes place not in a big field, but on a threshing floor in one particular location. It's not 3 months, it's overnight. And the focus here is that suddenly the entire parak is about a meeting between 2 people. There's nobody else there. So whereas the first chapter was a whole lot of different people, and at the end of it, the people of Beit Lechem, the second chapter was Ruth and Naomi and Boaz and the workers in the field and everybody else. The third chapter is just Ruth and Boaz. That's it. You get to the 4th chapter, most of the 4th chapter takes place in an hour. And it takes place in one very specific spot, which is the gates of the city. We spoke about this early. earlier, Shoftim v'shotrim titein lecha b'chol sharecha. That's where the court sits. A gate, parenthetically, when we think about a gate, if you've ever been to a dig of an ancient city, you know that a gate is not just a hole in the wall that you walk through. It's a very wide area with casements to protect and to have offices, and that's where all the judicial offices were in the ancient world. So Boaz goes to the gate of the city and negotiates, but it all happens in a short time right there. And remember, the very first phrase of the Megillah, it's not on the page, is Vayhi bimei shvot hashoftim, in the time that the shoftim led. And again, that's a period of diffusion, a period of tribal living, but the tribes don't get along. They don't take care of each other. It's a period in which things as crazy as a woman having her money stolen from her, her son, and she curses whoever stole it. Her son comes up to her and says, I stole it. So she says, oh, I don't want it to be a curse. And how does she bless him? She says, take this money and go build a separate altar for Hashem while the Mishkan is in Shiloh. And he does. And that's how strange the book is. I won't even get into Pilegesh Begiva. The last 3 chapters are a horrific story. We move from there, we get all the way to the end, and the last word in Megillat Ruth is David. So it starts with Shvot HaShoftim, it moves to David. It starts with a very wide range and ends with a very narrow focus. It starts with diffusion of tribes and ends with a monarchy, a single monarchy and a united monarchy, which, as much as it may have been imperfect, is still the model that we look for when we say those words at the end of Megillat Eicha, Chadesh Yameinu K'Kedem, restore our days as of old. We're not looking for a split monarchy. We're looking for a united monarchy. We're looking for Am Echad Ba'aretz, Goy Echad Ba'aretz, for a single nation in the land. And so hopefully this chart kind of helps you visualize what I'm talking about. And so the idea, again, in sum, is that Megillat Ruth is a powerful book. It's a powerful story. It should be studied carefully, and there is lots of not only classical, but lots of modern commentary and discussion on it, which really highlights so many beautiful things about the text. But writ large, when you take the panoramic view, step away and look at it, what you see is a story that takes us from an era which was an attempt to live tribally, an attempt to live perhaps in the ideal fashion, in the idyllic fashion, but just did not work, and moving towards the united monarchy that we continue to long for and that we celebrate on Yom Tov. So I want to wish everybody a Chag Sameach, and thank you very much, Rabbi Rosenblatt, for organizing this. This is a Kiddush Hashem of great proportions, and Emir Hashem, next year, everybody will be able to sit together and study in person.
Amen. Well, and we'd love to have you come up here to Vancouver. Hopefully they'll open the border. Thank you so much. This was as good as advertised. I have to thank the person who gave the tip and who told me that we should invite you. It really has been wonderful. I hope Los Angeles continues to stay safe, and you also have a very nice Chag, whether you're doing indoor or outdoor minyanim or still at home.
Thank you very much. Chag Sameach. Believe it or not, I've got to go teach Beit Midrash in a few minutes.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you. All right, we now are going to I would say a local superstar that I don't know if everybody knows, but many know, is Rabbi Stephen Berger. And Rabbi Berger is his subject is, and I can't wait to hear this, because there are a lot of things that I could fill in the blanks here for him, but Rabbi is saying the most important plague in Jewish history, guaranteed. And I think it's interesting that he's giving this outside, because I think the plague spreads least outside. But on the other hand, Hashem told the Jewish people to stay inside for the plague of the firstborn. So I still don't know where you're going, but it is great pleasure. And I thank Rabbi Berger for all he does for our community. And with no further delay, Rabbi Berger.
Hi, everybody. Hope all is well with everybody. Yeah, maybe I oversold it a little bit. Maybe. We'll see. I'm going to share a screen with you, actually. It looks like a big topic here. I'm going to hold on, share it for you. So we'll do this together. And I'll present here. So the topic is, like I said before, The most important, and please put questions in the chat, I can see them. The most important plague in Jewish history guaranteed. So, okay. I actually undersold this, actually. This is the most important plague in all of history, guaranteed. All of history as we know it. So now we can get down to business a little bit. So what plague am I talking about here? Anyone want to guess I'm talking about here? Rabbi said maybe, the plague of 10th plague, whatever it may be. Anyone want to try and guess? You can just turn on your mic for a sec.
Rats.
Which one? Rats plague?
Yep, that one.
Rats? No, it's not going to be the rat plague. So I'm going to probably go forward. Oh, wait, I see another text here. Good chats. Make it a little interactive.
What about the plague in front of Jerusalem that smote the Assyrians?
Okay, so that is where we're going. Ralph, I always count on you to lead me to the punchline. Exactly that way, Ralph. So there is a plague, and then we're in a plague right now, obviously, so it kind of got me thinking. And by the way, this is not according to me. If it was according to me, I'd say you can just leave it behind. Forget what the Rabbi Berger says. He's not an expert in history. He's not an expert in these things. But this actually comes from historians. It doesn't just come from historians. It comes from a non-Jewish historian. So a non-Jewish historian who isn't particularly religious said the most important military battle of all of history is going to be the battle against Assyria, the battle that actually never took place. So I'm going to take you down this road. We'll see where we get to. So really, if I had to rename my class, I'll rename it to this. It's the plague that saved Jerusalem, ... and the world as we know it. If that plague did not happen, the world as we know it would be very, very different. Very different. This is the hypothesis of we'll get to it one second. So in Jerusalem, it's 7. Let's do a quick little history here, if we can. Is that in 701 BC, right? There was a plague, and there was a plague that basically what had happened is Assyria had come in. Sancherib. It was a big empire at the time. Judea was just a very small little like it was a vassal state for a while, and it was its own little empire. But really, and I'll show you a map of this in a second. But Sancherib came in, went through Judea, no less than 43 walled cities, most famous being Lachish, raised them all, went through them, conquered them all on the way to Jerusalem. And it looked like an end for our heroes in Jerusalem. And what had happened was they basically surrounded the gates, had basically, which we'll come back in a second, and I'll tell you what was actually said there. But they made ultimatums of such things, said we're gonna destroy you to the ground. Your God will not save you. And ultimately, what happens is that prayer between Isaiah prophet and Hezekiah, they make a commitment. And what happens ultimately is a plague hits Sancherib, and Sancherib is forced to flee with what little he has left and go back to his homeland, go back to Assyria, the capital there, Nineveh, to basically not come back again. And he didn't come back again. And we'll talk about a reason for why he didn't come back. But ultimately, the Jews are left alone. And unlike anything else, the kingdom was still intact. Judea's Hezekiah was still left as king, which was a very unique thing to happen at that time, despite all the battles and basically almost Judea being razed. It was, and this, one of the neat things about this is that the plague of Egypt, we believe it because we have the Torah and we have our parents that tell us that this thing happened. But for this plague in 701 BC, we don't need just our Tanakh to teach us this. It would be enough. But we actually have Sancherib themselves and outside corroborating evidence that this plague happened and ultimately Judea was saved. So where do I get this from? So I will show this. So the idea is that even something insignificant, like a plague, who would think that a plague can have such a big effect? Now, today, we have an understanding of this, but unforeseen consequences that may not be apparent for even generations, how a plague ultimately basically saved the free world as we know it. So we'll go back here in a second. I'm going to quickly pass that. So the Assyrian siege by Sennacherib of Jerusalem was a teeny kingdom of Judea in 701. The siege was lifted, a large part, after the army succumbed to a mysterious lethal plague. So the Assyrian juggernaut is this. So as you see, this green, everything here is Assyria. And then the little yellow you see there, that's Judah. And you can see Jerusalem right there. And basically, most of Judah actually succumbed to the Assyrian juggernaut at the time, as you can see. We are the underdogs of this particular fight, whatever it may be. So this is, Syria is coming to go over. And what had happened is a little history here, a little background here. Actually, before we get to the background, 3 questions I just want to try and answer. One is, what if the plague had not intervened? What happens if there was no plague in this section? What would have happened? 2, what if the walls had fallen and forced the exile of the population, had been Jerusalem's lot like its northern borders? Which means 20 years earlier, Israel was split into 2 kingdoms, and Assyria had already conquered the northern kingdom, and basically conquered it, expelled everybody, taken them back as slaves, and that's where we get the idea of the 10 lost tribes. We really don't know where those lost tribes truly are, and how would Judaism maintain? And then the last question is, what would our lives, right, our spiritual underpinnings be like 2,700 years later if basically Jerusalem had fallen? So again, I'm not going to give you a piece of Torah here. At the end, I'll talk a little Tanakh, but I'd like to pull out a book. And this is a book right here. And if I can, I'm going to, I see a chat here, 1 second. All right, so right here, we have a book. This book is called What If? The world's foremost military historians imagine what might have been. And the opening basically story, the opening up essay in the book is written by a professor in Chicago and a historian professor in Chicago. And he says, what if the Sennacherib, the king of Israel, had conquered Jerusalem in 701 BCE when he led his imperial army against the coalition of Egyptian, Phoenician, Philistine, and the Jewish enemies and handily defeated them all? What would have happened? So he writes like this. Sennacherib's army had occupied no fewer than 46 walled cities. And then at the end of the day, he says, interestingly enough, he thinks the Jewish people are kind of like trapped, like a bird in a cage. He had tried to conquer us. He had tried to go to Jerusalem. A plague hit, and he was forced to retreat. But he never came back, interestingly. I guess he thought we were just too small and too he's got a huge empire. He's got a lot of things to deal with. One little Jewish thorn, but he never came back to unseat Judah. I guess he just figured they're in a cage, they're fine. But a cage has 2 things. Cage does keep you in, but a cage also keeps them out, right? Anybody who knows Tweety and Sylvester knows that the Tweety bird likes the cage. So he writes like this. His name is William McNeely. He writes, this, it seems to me, is the greatest might have been of all military history. This may be an odd thing to say about an engagement that never took place. Yet Jerusalem's preservation from attack, right, by Sennacherib's army shaped the subsequent history of all the world far more profoundly than any other military action I know of. And this is a scholar here. Again, this is not just a person who's in Tanakh. He's a scholar of many eras of world history. And he says this military battle that never took place shaped the world more profoundly than any other action he knew of. I'll continue. I'm going to quote him. So, what's the story of Hezekiah? Hezekiah, the story is that basically his father was Ahaz, and his father basically sold his soul to the devil. His father, who was a believer in God, slowly began to not trust God, began to see the powers forming all around them, was worried the northern kingdom was going to attack him. He made a deal against against Aram. He made a deal with Sennacherib and Assyria to fight. And what he ended up having to pay tribute, and he had to pay more tribute, and he ended up worshiping their gods, and he closed the temple. And he basically, at the end of the day, he actually threw his own children into the fire to worship Molech, the god of Molech, in order to maintain his control as kingdom, when he was really had no power. He was completely at the will of everybody else. Comes Hezekiah, his son, and he forsakes everything of his father. Hezekiah begins to start rebuilding, and he starts rebuilding as the rabbi pointed out today. He wasn't a builder by himself. He was a builder with people. He was able to talk to people and get people, and he built up circles of influence. He started with the elders, the rich people, and he said, can I get some money to reopen the temple? And then he opened the temple, and he got all the Kohanim together, and he got all those Kohanim together. And then once he got those people together, he started getting the whole society together, and he got the whole society to come together and do things. And then when he got the whole society together, it wasn't enough for him. He actually expanded his influence, and the northern kingdom, the few people that were left in the northern kingdom that hadn't been kicked out, he issued an invitation to them to rejoin the basically the kingdom of Yehuda, to rejoin. And they laughed at him, and he didn't take no for an answer. He still pushed, and he invited them for a Passover ceremony. And this is Hezekiah. He was building, and he opened up the temple again. He started worshiping God, and he just threw off all foreign allegiances with any of Assyria. And that's why Assyria was not happy. That's why they came in and conquered. But ultimately, he even invited the northern kingdom, and the northern kingdom came. And by the way, an interesting thing here, they came late. And Hezekiah, either using a delay of a month, either using the calendar or Pesach Sheni, he actually, he delayed Passover by a month. Can you imagine if Rabbi Rosenblatt would say, like, let's delay Passover for a month, and we're going to celebrate it on this day instead. Maybe we should do that for Shavuot. This is great learning and all, but, maybe in another month, everything will be open. Rabbi, think about this. We can delay it for a month, right? Whatever it may be. Okay. Just an idea. Don't take it too seriously. So, so anyway, Hezekiah ultimately is going to be now, as basically Sancherib comes in, he's attacking and destroying everything in his path. He is an empire, a true empire. And Hezekiah is now trapped. And they basically encircled Jerusalem. And what was going to transpire is a guy named Rav Shakeh is going to come out. I'm going to read you this shortly of the dialogue that happened there and ultimately the end. So again, William McNeill writes in his essay, he writes, moreover, the revised Jewish faith, right, tempered in exile, subsequently gave birth to Christianity and Islam, the two most powerful religions in our age, and of course also retained its own distinctive following around the world, especially in the contemporary state of Israel. So he's saying like this: what would have happened, he writes, what would have happened to the Jewish people had they been exiled like the northern kingdom? He makes an argument, and he says, their end would have been like the northern kingdom. They hadn't planned, and they had doubts. Was Hashem still with them? Because the question is, how could somebody who doesn't believe in Hashem, this empire that's so strong, belittle the Jewish and our Jewish God so much? All right, maybe we're not behaving, but ultimately it's belittling God and going to destroy God's temple. That seems some counter to everything we can. And there's a concept called replacement theology. Replacement theology is that the idea being is that the might makes right. If you're being destroyed, it must be that your God is no longer strong. This is what gets Christians, and this is what gets Muslims in trouble, that they believe they have to be stronger in order to show that their God is in right. Whereas we changed our philosophy. This whole thing kind of changed our philosophy. We don't realize might makes right. And what had happened was that we had a real crisis of faith here. And what might have happened if we had been kicked out, that would have been the end of Judaism. And if that's the end of Judaism, then that's the end of Christianity. And that's the end of Islam. They never are born because the Jewish underpinnings have been exiled and lost, just like the 10 tribes. So he says that this thing will give them time to begin to shape and reshape their understanding of what it means to be. And that when you get kicked out of a land, it isn't because your God is weaker. It's not because of replacement theology, but it's because you're not behaving. You're not doing what God wants. And when the Jews are finally exiled later on by basically Nebuchadnezzar, the Jews are understanding that they're being exiled not because God isn't around for them. It's simply because they've misbehaved with God, and that is why they're being kicked out. And that is what's going on. God is choosing to let this happen. And this plague, this God-inspired plague, that basically single-handed, they didn't have to lift their hands and destroy any of their enemies, was the proof in the pudding, so to speak, that God was still with them. And this was the faith, the sign, like that little Hanukkah thing of oil was the faith. God shows himself when sometimes he needs to be shown. God shows himself to give you that little bit of faith that you just need at the right moment in time. And the people began to understand that God did not abandon them. God is there. And look at what God can do. And that faith served them for when they were exiled and gone off to Nebuchadnezzar. And the Jewish community was able to persist and re-accept Torah at the time of Purim time when they were in Persia. They were able to re-accept and stay Jewish. And that's why William McNeill ultimately says that if they had been exiled now, there would have been no Jewish people left. It would have gone like the 10 tribes. There had been no Christianity and no Islam. And I'll just quote for you, if I can here. None of this come to pass if the kingdom of Judea had disappeared in 701 BC, as the kingdom of Israel had done a mere 21 years earlier in 722. And the last thing he writes here, is, in all probability, the people of Judah would have met the same fate if the Assyrian army had attacked and captured Jerusalem in 701 BC and treated its inhabitants as they had treated those of Samaria and other conquered places before. So if so, Judaism would have disappeared from the face of the earth, and the two daughter religions, Christianity and Islam, could not possibly have come into existence. In short, our world would be profoundly different in ways we cannot really imagine. So the biblical stories, these stories shape Jewish memories of what had happened before the walls of the city, and the memory made it plausible to believe in the God of Moses and David was in fact omnipotent, right? Protecting his worshippers from the mightiest monarch of the day. And I think we have now just an idea, again, at the end of this, that's we do not know what this plague is going to leave us, right? Who would have thought back then in the middle of this plague that it would have been the changing tipping point for everything Jewish? No one would have thought such a thing, right? But the fact is we do not know what things that are happening. We don't know what little things, but we can be sure that think about this is that we heard from the speaker earlier, Mark Twain, of the impact we made on the world, that there would have been no Jewish impact in the world had there not been this plague against the people of Sancherib. And I want to finish off, if I can. I'm going to stop sharing. I'd like to read you just from the book of Isaiah here very quickly. If I can locate it here, just 1 second, I will escape this. And so he says here, the circumstance of the Assyrian withdrawal from the walls of the belief in 701 confirmed the implausible belief, proving God's universal power to pious and eager believers more clearly and far more convincingly than ever before. This makes it most fateful, might have been, of all recorded history, according to William McNeill. And again, like Isaiah, in the book of Isaiah, Rav Shakeh shows up at the walls. The scene is set in Isaiah. And he says, look, they cried out in a loud voice in the Jews' language. They wanted to intimidate them. He wanted to make the Jews not believe in their own God. He spoke actually in a very crude language. It was an insulting language to the Jews, a haughty language. It was an insulting. And he said, these are the words of the great king, the king of Assyria. Beware, don't listen to Hezekiah. Don't let him persuade you. The Lord will deliver us. Hath any gods of the nations delivered out of the hand of Assyria? You think your God's going to deliver you? No God has ever delivered you. Where are the gods of the Hamath and the Arphad? Did they deliver these people? Your God is going down just like before, and all these other gods. And Hezekiah responded by praying, and he said, "O Lord of hosts." He didn't even go talk back to Rav Shakeh. He said, "God of Israel that dwells between the cherubs, thou art God, even thou alone, all of the kingdoms of the earth, thou made heaven and earth. Turn your ear and hear the words of Sancherib, the which he sent reproach to you, the living God. Now therefore, save us from his hand, that all the kings of the earth may know that you are the Lord, and you only." And then Isaiah sent word to Hezekiah saying, basically, he shall not come into the city, he shall not shoot an arrow, and that basically he would die of this plague. And what happened was the king of Assyria departed, went and returned, and dwelt in Nineveh, and that all that happened. And that is the end of the story. And that is why I believe, not based on but based on research, that I think this is perhaps the most important plague, not this one. The one back then is the most important plague in world history.
Excellent. Thank you, Rabbi Berger.
My pleasure.
We're now moving on. You'll forgive me. I'm moving everything on very quickly. The theme that we chose is very much along the lines that Rabbi Berger sort of brought out. Is that there have been real life-changing moments in Jewish history, and Rabbi Federer is going to take us to the next one, which is his title is the most influential book that shouldn't have been written, and it reflects a major change in the way in which Torah is transmitted. And so it is with great pleasure that I give you Rabbi Federer. You're on.
Okay, thank you. I want to discuss, as Roseblatt just mentioned, the theme is before and after life-changing moments. And I want to discuss what is probably not just the top 10, but probably within the top 5 of life-changing moment in Jewish history. It fit the top 5 of changes in Jewish tradition and in our Torah study. It might even be the number 1 change. And what I want to do during our time is to go through 3 parts of it. To go, first of all, through the background, to start from the beginning up until the point of the crisis. There was a certain crisis which occurred. Number 2 is to go through the solution and to explain how they were able to come up with such a solution. And then the third part is to derive some lessons from that experience, from that change. So first we're going to discuss the background. The background starts all the way back to what we're going to remember in about 25 hours.
It's the most important plague in the world.
It's when we received the Torah, which we remember on Shavuot. So we received the Torah on the year 2448 in the Jewish year, which is 1312 BC. That's when we received the Torah. The Jewish people were on Mount Sinai. At that time, we did not just receive the 10 Commandments. We did not just receive our written Torah, the Torah that we read from every single week. But during that time, at that time on that day, we also received the entire oral Torah. The entire oral Torah was also given on that day. So when we were given the written Torah, just for example, we were told to put on tefillin, that you should put on tefillin. That's written in the written Torah. What does tefillin mean? What does tefillin look like? That's all part of the oral Torah. Where should I place the tefillin? How do I put it on? That is all part of the oral Torah. That was given all on Mount Sinai. The Torah says if you want to have kosher meat, you have to do shechita. You have to slaughter the animal. Where do I slaughter the animal? How do I do it? All that is part of the oral Torah. So on the day, what we celebrate on Shavuot is both the giving of the written Torah and the oral Torah. What's important here, and we're going to try to explain this idea in a few minutes, is that there's a commandment that the written Torah can only be written. It has to be, you're not allowed to even say it orally, what's written in the Torah. And the oral Torah, you're not allowed to write down. There's a prohibition to write down the oral Torah. And we'll try to explain why there is that prohibition in a few minutes. If we now jump approximately 1,400 years, we're jumping 1,400 years after the building of the first temple and the destruction of the first temple, the building of the second temple and the destruction of the second temple. We're moving to the years 170 to 200 of the Common Era. Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi, there's a person by the name of Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi who notices significant changes that are occurring as a result of the destruction of the second temple. So there's the destruction of the second temple, and he sees essentially 3 things. He sees that it's likely that the temple will not be rebuilt, not only in his generation, but in many generations. It's not going to be rebuilt in the near future. That's the first thing he sees. The second thing he sees is that there are Jews that are leaving Israel, and they're being dispersed throughout the land. And the third thing that he notices is that the Sanhedrin, the central authority, the judicial court, is losing authority. They're becoming much weaker. And he sees that people are drifting further away from the central authority, the Sanhedrin, the central, the Supreme Court essentially is in Israel. People are leaving Israel. They're going to leave Israel for many generations. How are we going to be able to continue, specifically the oral Torah, the oral tradition, for many generations if everyone is going to be leaving the land of Israel? And so he comes up with the idea to compile the oral Torah, to write the oral Torah down into what we call the Mishnah. And this is the writing of the Mishnah, which took place in the year 200 of the Common Era, around the year 200. And so he has this idea of writing down the Mishnah. This is his solution to this crisis. Now we're gonna ask the question. The question is, how did he have the right to write down the oral Torah? We just said that there is a prohibition to write down the oral Torah. So we'll get to that in a minute. But to finish off the writing of the Talmud, by the middle of the 4th century, they come up with the idea to write the Jerusalem Talmud, and after the Jerusalem Talmud, the Babylonian Talmud. The Babylonian Talmud is essentially, and the Jerusalem Talmud is essentially a commentary on the Mishnah. The Mishnah itself, the word Mishnah, means to repeat. And so the Mishnah itself, it's not even the laws in its detail. The Mishnah is really just, it's shorthand. It's very much shorthand, just to trigger your memory to figure out what you should focus on. And it seems like Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi, he wanted to make some sort of compromise, to keep it as an oral Torah, but to write a few things down. So he wrote it down in shorthand so that it would still require the oral tradition. It still requires a teacher to pass it down to the student, but you have that text as to provide some sort of help for you, and that's the Mishnah. But they started to notice that things were getting worse because of economic reasons and also because of persecution. More and more people were leaving Israel, and a second thing occurred, which is really fascinating. It was the beginning of disputes among the Jewish people in terms of Jewish law. Could you imagine? We're talking about here now the middle of the 4th century. The Torah was given in the year 1312 BC. That means during that entire time, over 1,500 years, there was not a dispute, a single dispute from the oral tradition. This is an oral tradition that's passed down from generation to generation. You would expect people to forget the laws, to have some sort of dispute about what's going on. If anybody's been in any sort of, if anybody's studied the Talmud, they'll see tons and tons of disputes. If anybody goes to a meeting, any sort of meeting, there's disputes. But the oral tradition was passed down from generation to generation for over 1,500 years without a single dispute. They started seeing that people were starting to lose it. They were starting to forget what they've been taught, and that led to arguments. And so they felt the need to write down the Gemara, to write down the Talmud around the middle of the 4th century. The Jerusalem Talmud and the Babylonian Talmud. And there's a lot to discuss within that, but we don't really have time to discuss the two different Talmuds. And so they wrote down the oral Torah. And the big question is, how did they have the right to write down the oral Torah? There's a commandment that the oral Torah is the oral Torah. So how do you have the right to write it down in the Mishnah and in the Gemara? Until today, we rely on this. We write everything down. There's lots of the oral Torah that's written down. Any new Torah-centered book, any book that's discussing Torah literature, any source sheet that just came up should not have been written. It really should not have been written. We only are allowed to write it down now because of Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi, because of this decision to write down the oral Torah. And how do they have the right to do this? So we're moving on to the solution. The solution was they had a problem that they were forgetting, that people were being spread out, that they knew that the temple wasn't coming. They didn't think the temple was coming very soon. So the solution was to write down the oral Torah. And how do they have the right? How is this permissible for them to write down the oral Torah? So there are 3 different explanations that are given answers to this question. And I'm going to go through the 3 different answers. The first one is that it's really not a biblical obligation to write down the oral Torah. It's really just a rabbinic obligation. It's not a biblical obligation. And since it's a rabbinic obligation, they saw that this was really a crisis. There was a crisis amongst the Jewish people, and they said that the rabbis have the right to forego their own decree. It was their own decree, so they decided to get rid of it. And that's a minority opinion that they explain that they got rid of their own decree. The second approach is really a very interesting approach. It's based off the Talmud, but I'm going to really translate here from Maimonides. And Maimonides says as follows, and this is really a fascinating idea here. The Rambam Maimonides says that if the court system sees, let's say the Supreme Court or the leading rabbis, the leading scholars, they see that they, just for a temporary time period, they should get rid of a positive commandment or a negative commandment in order to bring the Jewish people back to their tradition and to save people from stumbling, then they're allowed to do it on a temporary basis. That we have the right to get rid of certain laws, to just completely get rid of them. One of the laws is to write down the oral Torah, that we have permission to get rid of a biblical law if we, on a temporary basis, if it's going to have if it's going to have a significant change, a significant positive outcome, that it's gonna change things. And he gives an example for this. He writes this down and he says this is comparable to a doctor who does an amputation to a person's hand or to a leg in order so that the person could survive. That sometimes it's necessary to amputate a leg for the sake of the person to live. And the same thing is true with the Jewish people. Sometimes it requires one to amputate to get rid of a commandment if it's for the overall benefit of the Jewish people. And so they felt that at that time it was necessary to essentially violate a commandment, that you have that a commandment where you're not allowed to write down the oral Torah, because it was necessary to preserve the Torah, to preserve Jewish tradition for all future generations, which is correct. Till today, it's necessary for us to have the Mishnah, to have the Gemara, to have all the literature that we have in order for us to remember and to know what to do and to retain our tradition. Now, according to this approach, the approach says, if you were listening carefully, it says only on a temporary basis. Now, for the Mishnah was written in the year 200 of the Common Era. So how do you define temporary? It's been around for now, a little less than 2,000 years. So it's the difficulty within this approach is to say that this was only allowed on a temporary basis. It ends up being quite difficult to give this approach. But even within this approach, it's a fascinating approach in terms of how far you could go with this. You could have various situations. A person can think of different situations where maybe it would be better for the Jewish people in the long run to violate a certain commandment, to really, for the betterment of the Jewish people, for them to maintain their Jewish tradition. And it's a dangerous path to go, because how do we know whether this is the right decision or the wrong decision? And only the leading Torah scholars can make this decision. And it's really, I'm sure at the time when Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, when he made this decision, it was a lot of pressure was put on him as to whether or not to do this. But according to this approach, he had the right to get rid of a biblical commandment if it was for the survival of the Jewish tradition of the Torah, of the study of Torah for all future generations. That is the second approach to this, to explain how they had the ability to do this. The third approach, again, the problem with the second approach is that it doesn't seem to be temporary. It's been going around. We still write things down till today for almost 2,000 years. The third approach is to say that, no, really, we don't have the right. We don't have the right to make a seemingly permanent change. We don't have such a right to make a permanent change. This commandment to write down the prohibition to write down the oral Torah is really, it's just ideal. It's not, if it's in the ideal state. There's a commandment that in the ideal state, you should have the oral Torah remain oral. That's in the ideal state, that's what a person to do. If a person cannot if you cannot do that, if you cannot keep it oral, so then you have the right, even on a biblical level, you have the right, you have the ability, it's permissible to write it down. You could write down the oral Torah, but in its ideal form, the oral Torah should remain oral, which means that in its ideal form, the Mishnah should not be written down. The Gemara should not be written down. We should not have any text. We should not have the source sheets that were handed out, that were shown here. We should not have anything written down. In its ideal form, we should just have things passed down. The only thing you can write down is the Torah, the written Torah itself. The written Torah itself is what we could have written down. Everything else has to be transmitted orally. In its ideal form, we can no longer do that because we're going to forget. We're all dispersed. We're spread out. But it's an ideal form. That's really what we should do. And the question is why? Why can't we write it down? What's the problem with writing down the oral Torah? It seems to be working. It seems to be a good idea. Rabbi Yehuda Anasi, what he had in mind was it was pretty successful. It continues to remain. It's a bestseller, the Talmud and the Mishnah. So what was wrong? Why is it not ideal to write down the oral Torah? So there are different perspectives on this question, but I just want to present one perspective on this, and that is when you write something down, so then it's now yours to interpret in any way, shape, or form. You have it written down, and now you could do whatever you want with it. It's based on your own interpretation. When we have an oral Torah forces us to have somebody teach it to us, to pass it down where they heard it from, the way they heard it from their teacher, and their teacher from the previous teacher and from the previous generation. It requires knowing the background, knowing the context. And if you have something which is written without the context, so then you could have 5 people, they could all interpret it in different ways. And so the value to having an oral Torah is to understand that we have to have a teacher. We have to understand the context to interpret it the right way. And so that would be in its ideal form. We don't have that anymore, but that would be, we lose that. 1 minute, oh boy. So we've lost that by writing it down. And just as an example, I'll give an example. I only have 1 minute, and this might lead on to Rabbi Rosenblatt's discussion as he discusses writing down the written, the Torah on the internet and different things like that. But when Art Scroll Gemaras were written, Art Scroll Gemaras translated the old Hebrew Aramaic Gemaras into English, into modern day Hebrew. So when they first wrote down, they first translated the Gemara, the Vatican bought every single Talmud that came out from Art Scroll. They bought it. You'll find the entire Art Scroll Gemara in the Vatican. You'll find Art Scroll Gemaras in South Korea because for some reason they're obsessed with the Talmud. You'll find it everywhere. It's on the internet. You can read it. And if you read it without having the proper context or anything, you could misunderstand it completely. We have it written down, and once it's written down without having that oral tradition, it could be completely misinterpreted, which is what takes place also on the internet today. You could have sources. I hope this isn't what Rosenblatt plans on speaking about, but no. Okay, good. But people could just completely misinterpret the sources, and so even though today, and I'll conclude with this, a lesson is even though today we have that right it's permissible to write things down, to write Torah content down. We could write it, the oral tradition, but we have to keep in mind that the oral Torah, the concept, the value, the ideal of having an oral tradition is essential. And to have that teacher to provide context and to provide the proper understanding is essential in our tradition. And it's something to keep in mind as we go into Shavuot. Shavuot is the holiday to celebrate the receiving of the Torah, of the written Torah, and of the oral Torah. So thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi Fettergren. It was great. Really enjoyed it. And now we're going to another local rabbi, my co-conspirator in this. Really, actually, maybe even it was his brainchild. Rabbi Gabay was the one who imagined that we could do this. We always talk about doing things together with Beit HaMidrash, but this is our first opportunity to really do something on this scale together. And it's really a great pleasure to have Rabbi Gabay share the next presentation. Rabbi Gabai is speaking on a subject which is, I would say, it's very Sephardic in many ways, which is how the greatest tragedy sparked the greatest creativity in a millennium.
Okay, thank you, Rabbi. So today I'm pretty much going to bridge the gap between our last speaker, Rabbi Federgren, and his topic, and our next speaker, which is a guest speaker from Los Angeles, who authored a book called Mavericks, Mystics, and False Messiahs, who's going to give an extensive background on Shabtai Tzvi, which he wrote about. So I want to give you a bit of background. Like Rabbi Rosenblatt mentioned, the truth is I am the Sephardic rabbi. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the Sephardim and the impact the Spanish Inquisition had on the world. So here we go. First of all, a little bit of background. The name Sephardim, Sephardi, what does that mean? It's pretty much Jews that came from the Iberian Peninsula. Now, the truth is, the Iberian Peninsula is actually quite close to my heart, seeing that I spent 4 good years of my life before I arrived to Vancouver in Gibraltar, which is part of it. But essentially, the Iberian Peninsula encompasses Spain and Portugal. And there's varying different sources on how long the Sephardim were in Spain before Spanish Inquisition. Some date it back to even 3,000 years. There's some sort of historical record of Shlomo HaMelech collecting taxes from his subjects in Spain. And other sources, I'm not going to go into it. But I just want to point out two very interesting differences between Sephardim and Ashkenazim. And that is as follows. Sephardic Jewry, back in the day, had a very unique ability to bridge the very fine line between high-level scholarship in Torah and secular studies. I mean, many of the greatest rabbis of the Rishonim in the essentially the medieval era were pretty much the greatest rabbis and also considered the greatest philosophers of the time, the greatest poets. Poetry at the time was a very, very popular thing. Greatest doctors in the secular world. And people like the Rambam, who obviously was one of the most famous, the Ramban, who people don't know was also a doctor, Rabbi Yehuda Halevi, and the Abarbanel, who was the finance minister for King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella. So essentially, that difference is a very, very unique difference, as opposed to the Ashkenazim. The Ashkenazic Jewry were usually much more insulated and were either one or the other. Another very important difference is between Ashkenazim and Sephardim, that when it came, the flip side of it, is at the end of the day, when it came to the Crusades and stuff like that, the Ashkenazim were pretty much ready to, when they were living a more insulated life, when someone came to them and told them, listen, it's you or you either baptize or you either convert or you're done, they were prepared to be killed, al Kiddush Hashem, rather than give up their values, as opposed to the Sephardim, where you find so often, as so common, with the Marranos, the crypto Jews, the conversos, who were prepared to give up their religion looked like they gave up their religion. Really, they were practicing Jews in secret, but that is a discussion in its own right, whether it's correct or not. But essentially, that's a very interesting difference between Ashkenazim and Sephardim back in the day. Anyway, Spanish Inquisition, the Alhambra decree. The Spanish Inquisition lasted lasted for a few hundred years, but the main crunch with Torquemada, who was the Grand Inquisitor, who eventually, approximately over 12 years, they actually went ahead and they condemned over 13,000 cases of conversos. They burned 2,000 of them, according to Paul Johnson, The History of the Jews, at the Auto de Fe, and many others, which different records about. The Alhambra decree, also known as the Edict of Expulsion, was an edict issued on the 31st of March 1492 by the joint Catholic monarchs of King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella. Now, they ordered the expulsion of all Jews. You either go and you convert or you will be expelled. Interestingly enough, Don Yitzchak Abarbanel, famous finance minister of the king, was allowed to stay with a minyan of people, but obviously he rejected the offer and was expelled with his brethren. He did manage to tried to bribe the king to keep the Jews of Spain in there. But apparently there's a very famous story that Torquemada came prancing in, and he says, throws a crucifix down in front of the king and queen. He says, whether like Judas, they would betray their lord for money. And in the end, he only managed to get the date of the expulsion extended by 2 days. Over half of Spain's Jews converted as a result of the religious persecution. And many, many Jews, an unknown number, between 40 to 100,000 Jews were expelled, known often as the Megurashim, the expelled ones, and only many years later returned to Spain following the expulsion. Now, one of those Jews, one of those families who were part of this expulsion was someone who was going to change the face of Judaism until today. And his name was, he was a little 4-year-old boy, his name was Rav Yosef Caro. Rav Yosef Caro, the son of Rav Ephraim. He was born in Toledo, in Spain, in 1488, died at the age of 87 in 1575. Very fondly and often referred to as the Mechaber. The Mechaber is the author. He authored the famous work, the Shulchan Aruch, Code of Jewish Law, and by Sfaradim, mostly referred to as Maran, the teacher. He was orphaned in the early age, and he had 3 wives. After each one died, he remarried. He buried 3 of his children in his lifetime, and he died age 87, and 3 sons actually survived him. So at the age of 4, his family is expelled from Spain, and he fled to Portugal like many of the Jews. Until less than 5 years later, in 1496, December 1496, essentially the daughter and the son of the monarchy in Portugal and Spain actually got together, and the marriage was hinged on if they would expel the Jews from Portugal, which was a done deal, and that was it. Interestingly enough, I live not very far from there, but in Portugal, there's a small town till today called Belmonte, where the last few remaining Marranos actually practice all sorts of strange customs, like closing those shutters and lighting candles on Friday afternoon, Friday morning, and they cover it with baskets, all very interesting, the last remnants of the Marranos. So Rav Yosef Caro did his travels, went through Turkey, through Morocco, other places, and he eventually settled in Tzfat, in Israel, not Israel at the time, but that's where he settled. And essentially, Tzfat was a place of unparalleled time in Jewish history, with an explosion of Jewish creativity that lasted around 7 decades, till earthquakes hit the city and kind of decimated the place, and people moved out to Tveria and other places. Now, it's interesting to note that besides for his genius in halacha, Rav Yosef Caro, who wrote the Shulchan Aruch, but he was also a great Kabbalist in his own right. He often quotes the Zohar and his rulings in the Shulchan Aruch. He wrote a book called the Magid Mesharim, where he actually had an angel who used to come and teach him Torah every night, and he brings all sorts of interesting experiences over there. He befriended some of the greatest Kabbalists in Tzfat at the time, some of them very famous, people like Reb Shlomo Alkabetz, who was the author of Lecha Dodi, which we sing every Friday night. Obviously, most famously, he was incidentally the brother-in-law of Moshe Cordovero, the Ramak, who had a whole section of Kabbalah. And he was also most famously very close to, or not very close to, but also in close contact with Rabbi Yitzchak Luria, otherwise known as the Arizal. So incidentally, I don't know many people know this, but his son, Rabbi Yitzchak Luria's son, actually married the daughter of Rabbi Yosef Caro eventually. I once saw a response somewhere where there was a discussion at the engagement about certain halacha which he wrote, and where the Arizal argued on him. But the Arizal was much younger than him.
That's some real yichus.
Sorry?
That's some real yichus.
Huh? That's the real deal. So essentially, really, Tzfat was really such an incredible byproduct, if you want, of the Spanish expulsion. And I just want to discuss today a little bit, similar to what Rabbi Federman started, but we're going to go a little bit further. So Rabbi Caro wrote 3 main works. He wrote something called the Bet Yosef, which was written on the Tur, explained soon, the Kesef Mishnah, which was written on the Rambam, and most famously, obviously, the Shulchan Aruch, which became universally accepted as the unquestioned authority of the Code of Jewish Law. Now, it's interesting to note that he felt called upon to systemize the laws and customs of Judaism in the face of the disintegration caused by the Spanish Inquisition as a result of the whole turmoil, a bit like what Rabbi Federgren said, that at the end of the day, just like Rabbi Yehuda Nasi felt like, due to all the trials and tribulations the Jewish people were suffering, and Torah Sheba'al Peh is going to be forgotten, so Rabbi Yosef Karo felt the need to actually put a systematic set of laws in place which will be totally available to the public. A bit like what the Arizal did also as a result on the other side from Kabbalah, which was always kind of up there, and it became much more accessible to many people as a result of the success of Rabbi Yosef Karo. So going back a little bit, rewinding back a couple of thousand years, Sinai, 2448, year 2448, the Torah was given to us. 3 million people stood at the foot of the mountain. And what was given to us? Torah shebichtav and Torah sheba'al peh, the oral law and the written law. So we always talk about the written law as the Torah, but the oral law was given over, as Rabbi Federgren said, from teacher to student, and until many years later, the Rabbi Yehuda Nasi compiled the Mishnah because he was worried people were going to forget. Now the Rambam actually discusses in the introduction to his Mishnayot and Hilchot Mamrim, he actually talks about in two places. One he says 3, and another says 5, but 3 main sections which the Torah Sheba'al Peh, where the oral law is actually separated into. And he says as follows. He said, section number 1 is what's written, to explain what's written in the Torah. I think Rabbi Federgren mentioned Tefillin, so another classic. Pre-Etz Hadar, we go and shake a lulav with an etrog. And the truth is, it doesn't say an etrog specifically in the Torah. And the rabbis understand, or pretty much a Torah Misinai, that this was part of the oral law transmitted, that the Torah is referring specifically to the citrus fruit, the etrog. And obviously, that's why Jews around the world don't go shake mangoes. We all shake etrog. That's number 1. Number 2 is tools of expansion, using 13 principles and midot of Rabbi Ishmael to go and elaborate and explain what the Torah means. And finally, there were gezerot and seyagim, which are peripheral fences around the original decrees or mitzvot naverot, and those were primarily the 3 main brackets of included in Torah Sheba'al Peh, in the oral law. Passed over from rabbi to student, destruction of Bet Mikdash, we said, et lasot lashem, that Rabbi Yehuda Nasi goes and establishes the Mishnah and writes down something which was unprecedented because he wasn't allowed to, and he writes the Shisha Sidrei Mishnah, Shas Mishnayot, and he puts into various different sections. 300 years later, Ravina Rav Ashi closed the Talmud, the Babylonian Talmud, as known as the Gemara, and now we have Torah Sheba'al Peh in the format of all sorts of conversations between many, many different rabbis over 300 years, pretty much Torah Sheba'al Peh condensed into lots of arguments and conversations. Now, how are you supposed to extract practical halakha from that? So came along the Rif, Rabbi Yitzchak el-Fassi. I'm going to have to go quickly because we've only got 5 minutes. And Rabbi Yitzchak el-Fassi came along and said that I have a problem. How am I going to extract the halakha from the Gemara? So he goes ahead and actually takes out all the practical halakha from the actual Gemara, all the conclusions of the Gemara, and anything relevant to the day and age of his time. Now, the Rambam came along, and the Rambam revolutionized the entire concept of halakha, of halachic literature. Rambam was often known as the Rambam Reb Moshe HaSfaradi, who was born also in Cordova, 1138, 1204, and he decided to compile a book of halakha with no sources and no opinions, hence the great controversy with the Ravid, and he created this revolution to pretty much make a sort of encyclopedia out of halakha. He called his book the Mishnah Torah, and he split the sections into 14 different categories. Many sections, many subsections. So if you're looking for a certain understanding of Shachrit prayer, you don't have to start going through the Gemara and Brachot and trying to understand which chapter it is and what's the background, what's the practical halakha. You just go to the Rambam, boom, Bob's your uncle, you're good to go. The Rosh, who incidentally was the bridge between the Ashkenazim and the Sephardim, because he fled Germany after his rabbi was put into prison, and Maram Rothenburg, and he was being persecuted. He fled to Spain, where he actually met up with the Rajba. If I remember correctly, he actually also their children got married. And he became the rabbi over there. And that's why many Moroccan customs also are heavily influenced by the Ashkenazim, because you'll find the Moroccan Sifrei Torah are actually like long, not in the Sephardi style cases, because the Rosh was actually the rabbi of that area in Spain. And he also wrote these halachic conclusions, but he expanded a little bit with various different opinions. Finally, his son came along, and what his son did, his name was Rabbeinu Yaakov ben Asher, he did something incredible. He wrote something called the Tur, the Arba Turim, the 4 Turim, and he was writing contemporary halacha, again with a bit like the Rambam, no sources, no discussion or discussions, and he's not including the laws which the Rambam did include about Hilchot Bet HaMikdash, Tumah v'Tahara, all these things which are not relevant to today. And he goes ahead and he compiles all the main sources together with the Rambam, the Rif, and the Rosh and others, all in one place. And he split the halakha similar to the Rambam, but not into 14 sections, but rather into 4 main categories. And what are they? Orach Chaim essentially deals with daily life. So if you have any problems with daily life, Shabbat, Yom Tov, Shavuot, whatever it is, you go to Orach Chaim. Then you have the second section called Yoreh De'ah, which is ritual law, keeping kosher and laws of sexuality, family purity. Then the third category was Even HaEzer, primarily deals with marriage and divorce, and 2 minutes. And Choshen Mishpat, he's primarily dealing with monetary law. Now, the Kesef Mishnah, now going back to Al Shulchan Aruch, Rabbi Yosef Karo did something incredible. He took the Rambam. He said, Rambam, you've done an incredible job, but you've got no sources. You've got no background from the Gemara. How are we supposed to figure this out? So what did he do? He took the Rambam and he wrote up all the sources from the beginning of the Gemara until the very end. The next stage was the Bet Yosef. He took the Tur. He said the Tur is a little bit more elaborate. He's bringing all sorts of other rabbis and the Rosh, the Rif, and the Rambam, but again, no sources. So what's he going to do? The Bet Yosef, the Rabbi Yosef Karo, wrote a commentary on the Tur, where he goes from the Gemara, quotes it, quotes every word, every line. He brings a discussion of the various opinions. He explains them, and he gives a practical application to every single one of them. Now, eventually, what he did was, with the Shulchan Aruch, that he said that the Code of Jewish Law will pretty much be a condensed version or a summary of everything he wrote in Bet Yosef. Again, a bit like the Rambam, no sources, no background, but practical application of halakha, which became the most authoritative and widely accepted compilation of Jewish law ever written. Now, just to finish off, interestingly enough, printing started around that time, about 50, 60 years before, and one of the early 1600s, and one of the very first books to be printed was actually the Shulchan Aruch. Shas was first printed, the Talmud, later on the Shulchan Aruch, and it was printed in the lifetime in Venice in 1565, in the lifetime of the Shulchan Aruch, of Rabbi Yosef Karo. And apparently later on, there was actually a pocket edition, because if you look at the introduction of the Shulchan Aruch, he actually writes the reason why I'm going to write such a condensed version is that people should be able to go through 30 days. In 30 days, you should cover the entire 4 sections of Shulchan Aruch. And so they actually printed a pocket book style with 30-day pocket series. And one of the greatest concepts, just to finish off, that came out of the Shulchan Aruch was the uniting of the entire world Jewry. Never before was the world Jewry so connected that, a person came along and says, what are you doing? Yeah, I keep like Tosfot says. I keep like the Rambam says. Rambam wasn't universally accepted at the time. Shulchan Aruch came along later on, and what he did was, he brought everyone together, and even for Ashkenazic Jews, the Ramah went along and added footnotes to the Shulchan Aruch. Essentially, the Shulchan Aruch became the most widely accepted halachic authority, and anywhere in the world, till you go today, the Shulchan Aruch was considered the unifier as a result of essentially the Spanish Inquisition. That vacuum which was created caused Tzfat to flourish, where you had the Shulchan Aruch in one go with the practical halakha which we apply nowadays, and obviously the other side, the Arizal, which also essentially the Arizal's concept of talking about Mashiach and and having all sorts of effects in the upper spheres and heavenly worlds, it was essentially an opening to our next subject, which was Shabtai Tzvi.
Thank you, Rabbi Gabai. Really appreciate all the work that you've put into this. Just a quick question, because some people are not identified by their given names. Is Rabbi Dunner on this call, and I'm not recognizing you? Okay.
Let me try and call him. 1 second.
All right. So what I'm going to do, first of all, while Rabbi Gabai is doing that, I just want to point out something. I'm going to switch views here. Thank God there are 82 people on the call, and we have been going now for 2 hours and change. And I think that that's really impressive. And I think it's also really impressive that all the rabbis have kept to their schedules. That's also a really special thing. I think that next Shavuot, they're not going to let us give any more than 25 minutes at a time, because everybody has
coming on.
What's that? He's coming on. Okay, great. Because this has been such a great, people have really brought so much information in such a quick period of time. So just waiting for Rabbi Dunner to log on. Okay, I'm not seeing him just yet. Hopefully, just momentarily. Well, in the meantime, I'm
just
going to do it.
Second.
What's that?
Just logging in.
Okay. So I'm going to tease you into my session. My session is about current Torah on the internet. So just put a thumb. Oh, here we go. Here's Rabbi Dunner. Okay. I am now spotlighted Rabbi Dunner. Hopefully his video is coming on.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear Rabbi Dunner. It's wonderful to have you, Rabbi Dunner. Rabbi Dunner, I first heard of
I'm right here.
I first heard of Rabbi Dunner when I saw an internet lecture of his on the Yabloner Rebbe, which is a fantastic piece of research he did. It was really, really inspiring. But that's not his topic tonight. He has written a book about Shabbatai Tzvi. He comes from a very prominent German rabbinic dynasty, which speaks to our connection, because my great-grandfather was the Chazan in Hamburg once upon a time. And he also shares an island of origin with Rabbi Gabai. If you hadn't figured out, he's originally from the UK, and he's a great speaker, and we're really excited that he's decided to join us. Without taking any more of your time, Rabbi Dunner.
Thank you so much. I appreciate very much being invited on. And I spent a long time talking to Rabbi Gabai, and I know Richard as well, wherever he is. It's a great pleasure to be on together with you all. And I suggested to Rabbi Gabai that perhaps we do some type of interactive conversation. You know, I have so many rabbit holes that I can go down when I'm talking about false messiahs and maverick rabbis, that I sometimes need to be directed, and tonight is such an occasion. I know it's Erev Shavuot. I just want to say something very important, that it's traditional on the Shabbos before Shavuot, Parshas Bamidbar, to do the 6th perek of Pirkei Avos. There's a bit of a problem with that. Do you know what the problem is? There is no 6th perek in Pirkei Avos.
Can you
There's only one. So why do we learn the 6th perek of Pirkei Avos? It's part of Torah Shebaal Peh. And Torah Shebaal Peh is that we take it over to the next generation. We all have the right to study Torah and to be mechadish in Torah and to find those things in Torah which are interesting to us. And that is exactly the perek that we learn on the Shabbos before Shavuot. So I'm going to hand over to Rabbi Gabai. He's going to be my Torah Shebaal Peh prompter tonight.
So tonight we want to hear a little bit about Shabtai Tzvi, what he did, why he did it, and what was the after effects as a result until today.
So let me just give you a 3 or 4 sentence background to Shabtai Tzvi, which is that during the 16th century, there was a resurgence of Kabbalah in a place called Tzfat, Safed in Israel. Now, you'll probably imagine that Safed Tzfat is an ancient city that existed at the time of the second Beis Hamikdash, and probably even the first. It didn't. Tzfat was a city that was created by non-Jews as part of the silk trade. It was a place where they made silk garments. There were a lot of very wealthy people there, including obviously Jews. It was Eretz Yisrael, and they had money, and they brought great rabbis to Tzfat, and some of the greatest rabbis of that time lived in Tzfat in Eretz Yisrael, this new town that had been created in Galilee. Today it's a sleepy place in a corner of Eretz Yisrael, and there's many people who've never been there. But then it was a very important point on the Silk Road, or whatever it was, the trade routes of those days. One of the great rabbis of Tzfat was a man called the Arizal. And the Arizal was the foundational figure of what I would call modern Kabbalah. I'm using that term very loosely, because the Kabbalah is based on the Zohar. The Zohar appeared in a written form in medieval times, probably the 13th, maybe 14th century, in its fully written form. And it wasn't put together with quite the same rigor when it was finally written, committed to writing, as, let's say, the Gemara or even the Medrash. And therefore, since that time, there's been a lot of dispute as to whether every aspect of the Zohar can be considered as authoritative as, let's say, a Gemara. But that being said, the Arizal used the Zohar as a platform to launch something which was an end of days Kabbalistic theology, which had never existed before in the Kabbalistic world. Kabbalah predominantly been involved with describing and discussing how the world had come into being and what goes on in Shamayim, what goes on in heaven. That's really what Kabbalah was focused on. And there were little groups of Kabbalists that were dotted around the world, usually very small groups or even individuals that lived wherever they lived. And they were known as the Kabbalists of the town. They would maybe write a Kamea for someone if they were sick, and you'd go to them for a baracha. But essentially, they weren't mainstream, and they were deliberately such. The word Kabbalah means you can only become a Kabbalist if you receive your knowledge, your Kabbalistic knowledge, from someone who's received it from someone else. And it was a very elite group of people who were Kabbalists. But the Arizal had this dream that Kabbalah would be the platform for the Messianic era. And he launched it in his day, and he died very young. He launched this group of Kabbalists in Tzfat who openly studied Kabbalah and who were vigorously selling Kabbalah to as many people as they could. That Kabbalistic school percolated its way throughout the Jewish world. And around the same time, by the way, there was another great Kabbalist in the world. His name was the Maharal of Prague, a little bit later, within that century. He also began to involve Kabbalistic teachings in his interpretations of the Torah. Very, very unique material. And it's actually only since the days of Rav Kook and Rav Yitzchak Hutner and various others that the works of the Maharal have been studied in any great depth. And the idea of the machshava, the thoughts of the Maharal, have made their way into the mainstream. But the Arizal made his way into the mainstream much earlier on. One of the results of him wanting to launch a messianic era was that there were people who were very taken with this idea of messianism. I don't know if you know that when it comes to spirituality and mysticism, there is a human weakness, because somebody who is not mentally stable can be very drawn to mysticism and very drawn to spirituality in a way that can actually send them off the deep end. I said this in one of the talks I gave recently. You live in Vancouver, right? I'm assuming all of you live in Vancouver. There's no such thing as a Vancouver syndrome. Are you aware of that? I live in Beverly Hills. There's plenty of crazy people in Beverly Hills, but there's no mental condition known as the Beverly Hills syndrome. But Jerusalem has its own mental condition. Are you aware of that? It's called the Jerusalem syndrome. People come to Jerusalem and apparently they're completely normal until the moment they set foot into the old city of Jerusalem. And suddenly they go crazy and they begin believing that they're King David. I've met them. I don't know if you've ever come across them when you come to Jerusalem. They think they're King David, or they think they're the Messiah, or they think they're King Solomon, or they think they're Jeremiah, or they think they're Zechariah, or they think that they are Isaiah. They begin to take on this biblical role. It's called Jerusalem syndrome. It can attack people who are vulnerable to mysticism and spirituality as a mental condition. Now, that doesn't mean that people who study the Zohar, chas v'sholom, that they're mental. Of course not. Mysticism is the deepest and profoundest secrets of Torah knowledge. It's one of the 4 aspects of Torah knowledge that we have in what's known as Pardes, the garden of Jewish knowledge that underpins who we are as Jews. The Samach in Pardes stands for Sod, secret. The secrets of the Torah, Razeh HaTorah, are to be found in Kabbalah. But if you're not mentally stable, it's no good for you. Now, let me go to Shabtai Tzvi. That was a very long introduction. I said it was going to be 3 or 4 sentences. It was a bit longer than that, but hopefully I've given you some background that you can appreciate what I'm about to tell you. Shabtai Tzvi was born in Izmir, Smyrna, in Turkey. And he was a child of, in those days, the Jews, because they were the one nation in the world that had been deliberately scattered throughout every corner of the known world. All of them had representatives of their families or friends in different places on the trade routes. And therefore, if you want to trade, let's say, from the Far East and bring your product, whatever it was, if you were bringing spices or silk or precious metals or precious stones from the Far East to Europe, you needed trusted people along the way who could make sure that your product would make its way to the correct destination without getting stolen. The best people to do that were the Jews, because wherever they trusted each other and they had a network that spread throughout the known world. And by the way, this continued all the way through until the 20th century. It's only recently that globalization has taken the thunder out of the Jewish role in trade. But then Shabtai Tzvi's father was a wealthy trade representative who lived in that location, spoke multiple languages, had several children, one of whom was Shabtai. And the reason he was called Shabtai was he was born on Tisha B'Av that year. By the way, there is a tradition in Jewish mysticism that Mashiach is going to be born on Tisha B'Av, like a phoenix that comes out of the ashes, out of the fire. That Mashiach will be born as a way of salvation out of Tisha B'Av, the day when we commemorate the destruction of the temple. But that year, Tisha B'Av was on Shabbat. And therefore, his name was Shabbatai, our Shabbos. That's his name. And his father's name, his father had a surname, Tzvi, which makes us think he was probably of an Ashkenaz background. Tzvi was not a Sephardic name. And Shabtai Tzvi was very bright, very charismatic, great conversationalist, knew multiple languages, and did very well. He was very proficient at school. He did better than all his peers. And at some point in his teens, late teens, which is quite normal, he began to display what we recognize today as signs of mental illness, what we would call severe bipolar syndrome. And he was occasionally very euphoric and occasionally very depressed. So he would disappear into his room for days, sometimes weeks, or he was euphoric and full of energy. And by the way, when Shabtai Tzvi was full of energy, there was no one you wanted to be with more than Shabtai Tzvi. He was the life and the soul and the energy of any room that he was in. All eyes turned to Shabtai Tzvi. But he was odd. He got married, for example, refused to consummate the marriage. very quickly got divorced. Got married again. The same thing happened again, refused to consummate the marriage, got divorced. He began to get himself a bad name, and he drifted around, at that stage, he drifted around Europe, and then he gravitated towards Eretz Israel. When he got to Eretz Israel, he came via Egypt. When he was in Egypt, he became very friendly there with the head of the community, who was besotted with him, who felt that he was a fantastic person. But he noticed that he suffered from this depression occasionally. And he said, I heard that there is a healer who lives in Gaza. His name is Nathan. Nathan, as he's known, Natan Azati, Nathan of Gaza, was 10 years younger than Shabtai Tzvi. And he was, originally he had been a Talmudic scholar. He'd started studying Kabbalah, this Lurianic, this Arizal Kabbalah. He'd moved to Gaza because his wife was from Gaza. There was a big Jewish community in Gaza. And he was known as a healer. Shabtai Tzvi was a bit skeptical because he'd suffered from these bouts of depression all his life. But this guy said to him, I really think that you should go. And he went to Gaza and he met Nathan of Gaza. It was a fateful meeting. And when he met Nathan of Gaza fainted onto the floor. And when he got up, he said, I don't know who you are, but I dreamt about you. You're the Messiah. You're the savior of the Jews. You are going to lead the Jews from the four corners of the earth at their head as the Messiah and bring them back to the promised land and restore the glory of the house of David. Can you imagine you heard that? And I'm talking about you. I'm assuming that all the people on this Zoom are not suffering from any kind of Jerusalem syndrome or even Vancouver syndrome. Shabtai Tzvi was bipolar and had severe bipolar, and suddenly someone tells him, you're Mashiach. You're the king of the Jews. And Nathan of Gaza, see, Shabtai Tzvi wasn't very organized, and as charismatic as he was, he'd not been successful. I think I wrote in my book, and Rabbi Gabbai will correct me if I'm wrong, had it not been for Nathan of Gaza, we'd never have heard about Shabtai Tzvi. Never. You would never know anything about him. He would have disappeared without trace, part of the flotsam and jetsam of history. But you know what? Nathan of Gaza was very, very organized. He was a brilliant communicator, and he became Shabtai Tzvi's publicist. He became the PR office for the Shabtai Tzvi Mashiach campaign. And suddenly, Shabtai Tzvi was projecting himself, the year was 1665, was projecting himself around the Jewish world as Mashiach. It didn't go well for him. He traveled around first to Eretz Yisrael, in Jerusalem, and he visited Jerusalem at some point. They made fun of him. He went to Hebron, and eventually they split up. Nathan of Gaza began writing letters. He was a brilliant writer. He was, a gifted communicator. Began writing letters all over the Jewish world. And Shabtai Tzvi decided he was going to go. I don't know how big his entourage was. He was going to travel from Israel, from Eretz Yisrael, to Constantinople, which was the capital of Turkey, one of the most powerful centers of the Middle East, because that's where the Sultan of Turkey lived. And the Sultan of Turkey was in control of Eretz Yisrael. And Shabtai Tzvi decided he is going to go and visit the Sultan of Turkey and tell him, I am Mashiach ben David. I'm here to bring the Jewish people back to the Holy Land. You know the famous story about Napoleon. When he wanted to attack Rome, they said to him, how can you attack Rome? How is it possible that you'll go against the Pope? And he said, what are you talking about? How big is the Pope's army? I've got a much bigger army than the Pope. In other words, if it's about military success, I'm always going to beat the Pope, which is in fact what happened ultimately as a result of the Napoleonic Wars. The power of the Catholic Church diminished to a little rump. It's called the Vatican in the middle of Rome. Shabtai Tzvi didn't have an army. He didn't have any real soldiers, foot soldiers. He had no strategy. He had no plan. His plan was, I'm going to meet the Sultan of Turkey and I'm going to tell him I'm Mashiach and everything's going to fall into place. And he slowly meandered his way through communities in Europe. And I'm not going to get into all the details because there really isn't enough time. He arrives, he sailed towards Constantinople on the Black Sea, and there was terrible weather, and he's met in the port by soldiers belonging to the Sultan of Turkey, who unceremoniously arrested him and threw him into jail. And the Sultan of Turkey, ordinarily, if somebody was a rebel of that nature, would have had them immediately executed. But he was somewhat amused by this rebel, because as I've said, he wasn't a terrorist, he didn't have an army, he didn't even have a plan. So as much as the Jews, by the way, the Jews were very taken with him. He was a brilliant Talmud Chacham. He would come into a community, would give speeches, he did some really strange things. For example, one of the things that Shabtai Tzvi liked to do was to make brachas on things that you're not allowed to eat. So for example, he would take a piece of pork and he would make a bracha. He'd say, Baruch atah Hashem Elokeinu melech haolam, matir isurim. God who allows things that are forbidden. And one week, in fact, he turned into a Yom Tov week. And he celebrated all the Yomim Tovim of the whole year in 1 week. By the way, that would be great. The ladies would love that, wouldn't they? You'd have Pesach one day, the next day you have Shavuot, and the next day you have Rosh Hashanah, the next day you have Yom Kippur, the next day you have Sukkot, the next day you have Shmini Atzeres, and then it's all over. You're done for the year. But Shabtai Tzvi did it for serious. I'm making a joke. He was serious. Anyway, he gets to Constantinople, he's in jail, and the Sultan calls him in for a meeting. And one of his advisors was a Jew who could communicate with Shabtai Tzvi, and he says to Shabtai Tzvi, listen, you, as far as we're concerned, are a troublemaker. You could cause us terrible problems because we need the Jews in the Turkish Empire. They feed our economy. They're traders. They're extremely important. You want to take them all to Eretz Yisrael, and they're beginning to sell up their homes and to liquidate their businesses. You are destroying the Turkish economy. Now, you have two choices. Either we're going to kill you, or you can convert to become a Muslim. Oh, what do you think he chose? The year is 1666. What do you think he chose? Well, if he was Mashiach, he would have chosen to become a martyr, right? That's not what he chose. He became a Muslim. And in the year 1666, Shabtai Tzvi converted to Islam. The problem is that there was so much euphoria. There was so much euphoria with his messianic movement based on this Kabbalistic idea that Mashiach is imminently going to come. And here we have Mashiach in our midst. The people didn't believe that he'd really converted, but he had converted. And there were attempts to try and revive the messianic movement. Eventually he was banished and he disappeared to some obscure location where he died 10 years later. And he was only 50 years old when he died. Nosson of Gaza, Nosson Azati, continued to campaign. And what's so strange about this messianic movement is two things. First of all, it persisted for more than 100 years after Shabtai Tzvi died. People were still Shabbatians. They still believed in the Shabbatai version of Kabbalistic teachings and still believed in this antinomian, non-halachic Judaism. Some of them converted and became secret sectarians called the Donmeh sect. And they only disappeared, I think, sometime in the 1920s, 1930s. Some of them became mainstream rabbis in Europe. One of the other chapters in my book is about one of those mainstream rabbis, Rabbi Yonason Ebershitz, who was the chief rabbi of Hamburg, where your grandfather was a chazan, I think probably long time before. He was the chief rabbi of Hamburg, and he was accused by another great rabbi in Hamburg, Rabbi Yaakov Emden, of being a secret follower of Shabtai Tzvi based on various amulets that he had written for pregnant women to make sure that they don't die in childbirth. But that's a story for another time. I'm going to go back across to you, Rabbi Gabbai. I don't think I have much more time left, but if there's anything you feel I've left out or that I should address, I'm quite happy to do so.
So I think we're just run out of time. So thank you so much, Rabbi. It was a beautiful presentation. And if anybody wants to read a little bit more about it, then Rabbi Donna has written a book called Mavericks, Mystics, and False Messiahs, where you can read a little bit more about it at great length. Thank you so much, Rabbi.
Thank you, and Chag Sameach to all of you.
Chag Sameach. Thank you, Rabbi Dunner.
Thank you. All the best.
Okay. Well, so I guess I'm the
now
last,
for our final speaker.
I'm the final speaker. Well, but the good news is that I will help put you all to sleep, and you'll sleep very well tonight. Okay, so I am just going to share my screen here. The title of my lecture is Torah in Print, Torah on YouTube, Torah in Virtual Space, A View from the Middle of the Change. So what makes me different from all the other presenters tonight is that I am going to tell you about something that's happening right now. I don't have the benefit of hindsight. So here we go. A little bit just of context. Medium and message has been something which has really been very much part of the story. You heard that from Rabbi Federgren. You heard that from Rabbi Gabbai about the printing of books and how the introduction of the Talmud. Well, we sort of have this feeling that the Sefer Torah was always around the corner, that no matter when in Jewish history, you could just go out and find the Sefer Torah. I think there's a reasonable argument to be made that, for example, in the days of Yirmiyahu, you couldn't find the Sefer Torah very easily. I could even argue, I'm not sure it's safe to argue this, but it's possible that Yirmiyahu himself would have had trouble finding the Sefer Torah. How do I know that? Because the king in the days of Yirmiyahu was Yoshiyahu, and Yoshiyahu does a renovation on the Beit HaMikdash, and they find something that surprises them. What do they find that surprises them? A Sefer Torah. And so it wasn't that there was a Sefer Torah on every corner. The first time we start to see a Sefer Torah on every corner is Ezra. Ezra, in the return from Bavel, after the destruction of the first temple, when the Jews returned from the Babylonian Empire, the Edict of Cyrus the Great, so Ezra brings the Torah to the marketplace. It's the first time that we have Hagbah. It's the first time that Torah is literally, if you want to sort of context, Ezra basically says, I don't want you to go to Jerusalem to have to read the Torah. Or I shouldn't say that. But Ezra says, I don't want to have to go to Shul to read it. I'm going to bring it to Oak Ridge. And Ezra also does something else very interesting. Everything before Ezra, you pull things out of the ground, they're written in this alphabet. It's called Paleo-Hebrew alphabet, Ktav Ivri. And the Talmud tells us that Ezra changes the way that a Sefer Torah is written from Ktav Ivri to the Ktav that you know, Ktav Ashurit, which is the way in which standard Sefer Torah are written today. You recognize Ktav Ashurit. I would venture to guess that most people here cannot read this Ktav Ivri. But what did Ezra do? Ezra said, you have to read the Torah on Monday and Thursday and Shabbos. All of a sudden, you have this idea that the Torah is read on a regular basis. People have a direct contact with Torah Shebiktav. So it's a major change. Then another major change now we're going to fast forward to modern times. There's an article that appeared about 25 years ago called Rupture and Reconstruction, the Transformation of Contemporary Orthodoxy. This is written by Rabbi Dr. Chaim Soloveitchik, in which he says something very interesting. He says that what happens in the world is you had a Judaism which was mimetic. If, let's say, you lived in 1850 let's think of a good place to live in 1850. You lived in Frankfurt am Main in 1850. how would you learn to make Kiddush? Well, Tati made Kiddush. Zaidi made Kiddush. That's how you learn to make Kiddush. It was a mimetic culture. The way in which you learned how to daven, the way in which you learned the tune, the way in which you learned how to shake a lulav, you always did it the way that your parents had done. And it was a very tactile religion. So Rabbi Dr. Soloveitchik, this is the son of Rabbi Joseph Soloveitchik. So he says, if I were asked to characterize in a phrase the change that religious Jewry has undergone in the past generation, I would say that it is the new and controlling role that texts now play in contemporary religious life. What does that mean? That means that nowadays you have kids who go off to yeshiva in Israel, and they learn how to do certain things, how to do the bracha during Kriyat Torah, how to shake the lulav. They learn it from a book. Are you allowed to do this on Shabbos? Are you allowed to do that on Shabbos? It's not, this is how my bubby used to heat food on Shabbos. It's rather, this is how the Shmirat Shabbat Kilchata does it on Shabbat. Now, Rabbi Soloveitchik is a very insightful person, but I know exactly where this insight was triggered. This insight of his was triggered not only because of his view of contemporary life, but because the exact same thing had happened hundreds of years before. In the days of the Tosafot, you have a very similar transformation that copies of the Talmud make their way to France, and some of the students challenge Rabbeinu Tam, and they say the minhag, the way that we were blowing the shofar, is all wrong. We've studied the sugya in the Gemara, and the minhag, the custom that's going on here in France, is all wrong. Rabbeinu Tam yelled back at them, and he said, you know what you're saying about our minhagim? It is karov leminut. It's almost heresy, what you're saying. When you say that the customs are wrong and the Talmud is right, it's heresy, said Rabbeinu Tam. Rabbi Soloveitchik is seeing exactly the same thing. He's saying that what's happening is that people are taking texts and they're saying to their bubby and their zaidi and their mommy and their tati, they're saying, look, what we're doing is wrong because it's wrong according to the interpretation of the text. And he goes on, he says, that a way of life is not learned, but rather absorbed. Its transmission is mimetic, imbibed from parents and friends, pattern on conduct regularly observed in home and street, synagogue, and school. We are mimetic creatures, and that's how Judaism was transmitted over and over and over again. And he says, he says in the next quote, the reconstruction of practice is further complicated by the ingrained limitations of language. Words are good for description, even better for analysis, but pathetically inadequate for teaching how to do something, right? Again, try telling someone how to tie a tie or tie your shoes using just words. One learns best by being shown. That is to say, mimetically, when conduct is learned from text, conflicting views about its performance proliferate, and the simplest gesture becomes acutely complicated. Rabbi Soloveitchik brings up the idea that in this text generation, you had people who would question their Zaydi's Kiddush cup and say, my Zaydi's Kiddush cup isn't big enough because I read in this book that it really needs to be 5 ounces and my Zaydi only made it on 3.5 ounces. So it's not kosher. But what Rabbi Soloveitchik is pointing out is that the move to text creates a sort of a disembodied Judaism because our Judaism was very mimetic. It used to be taught by Zaydis. Rabbi Soloveitchik makes the argument that one of the reasons for this is that after the Shoah, lots of people didn't have bubbies and Zaydis. They needed to go to the text to be able to recapture the knowledge. Now, I want to catapult us into the next move, the internet. So you can today go to yutorah.org and you can get thousands upon thousands of hours of shiurim. There are people who have finished the entire Talmud listening to Rabbi Shalom Rosner at yutorah.org. There are also internet phenomena like Rabbi Uri Amos Sherki, who you can see, I took this so you could see the the view count. The view count he gets is 2,065, and that's in French. This is one of his French language. He also became very popular in Israel over YouTube, over Moreshet, and he has thousands and thousands of hours. You have these rabbis now who are broadcasting across the internet to very, very wide audiences. There is nowhere that I know of that you're, well, maybe the Belzer community, maybe certain Hasidic communities, but the geographic reach and the reach that Rabbi Sherky has is really, really unique. But I want to get deep into the weeds here. You ready? Let's get deep into the weeds. Can you ask your questions on the internet? So maybe about 10 or so years ago, there's a couple of different Israeli internet portals which allow you to ask your questions to the rabbi over the internet. So Yuval Shurlo started doing this first on a portal called Moreshet. Now you can see this. I screen captured it for you. It's called Kippah, which is sort of a national Orthodox site, and you can get reasonably live answers to questions on these platforms. And Rav Shurlo, when he started, he figured it's 2 or 3 questions a day, he can handle it. When he realized it was serious, he got a question from a girl who was abused by her father and wanted to know if she had to disclose this to her fiance or her husband, soon-to-be husband. That's when he realized that this was a really important place. The nature of the questions is also very interesting. About 10% of the questions come from Haredi women, says Rabbi Yuval Shurlo, because generally in the Haredi community, it would be generally understood that the husband would ask the question to the rabbi. But if the wife wants to know the halacha, she wants to get her own independent opinion, she can secretly do that on the internet without violating any of the customs, etc., of those communities. But perhaps the most important group of people are people who are embarrassed about their questions. For example, there was one question that Rabbi Shurlo answered, which was the question of how a son is talking. He says, "I'm having trouble with the mitzvah of kibbud av v'em. I try to keep all my mitzvot, and I understand it, but when I go and visit my mother, she makes me absolutely meshugana, and I can't stand when she tells me to do things, and I don't want to listen to her." So Rabbi Shurlo is a very wise man, and he says, listen, you don't have a challenge with the mitzvah of kibbud av v'em writ large. You're having an issue. You're a post-adolescent, and you're having the same problem that everybody else has always had for time immemorial in this. It's a stage. I'm giving you context. Move on. You'll work on the mitzvah. One day you'll be fine. You'll be able to manage it. In the screen capture, I just want to show you how modern these questions are. One of the questions is, if you see just in the middle there, it's a dalet. It says dating, v'hamareh hachitzoni, dating and physical appearance. Rabbi Shurlo is being asked, the guy says, I have trouble, how much, what if it's not clicking? What if I'm not really attracted to her? How do I manage that? And Rabbi Shurlo is very good. He basically says, look, you have to, if you can convince yourself that it's not important to you, then maybe it's not important to you. But if at the end of it, you're sitting in front of the mirror trying to convince yourself that it's not important to you, it's still an issue, then listen to it. And you have to be able to know who you are when you get married. By far, though, I think the most famous responsa of Rav Shurlo on the internet is his responsa to a 35-year-old woman who says she has no prospects for marriage and she very much wants to have a child. And Rabbi Shurlo, in a very interesting tshuva, basically says that, I wish I had time to talk about this tshuva in full because it's a very, very interesting, very insightful tshuva. He says that she is allowed to undergo artificial insemination, and he quotes maybe the earliest possible halachic source. He quotes the story of Rachel, who says, Yaakov, give me a child, im ayin meita anochi. If you don't, I'm dead. He says it's like death. This is like pikuach nefesh. Now, I would say pretty much every other rabbi in Israel disagreed with him, but I've read both sides. I think he writes a very, very convincing tshuva. This is not the place to give halachic positions, but Rabbi Shurlo is projected himself into a very, very relevant space in Israel over this question. I really have only 3 minutes left, so I'm going to take you to one other very interesting place. So if you think tshuvas over the internet are a new boundary, how about tshuva by text message? So Rav Shlomo Aviner, who is a very prominent national religious figure, rabbi in Israel, and so he gets questions by text. And part of the argument for this is if you're a soldier out in the field and you need to know, can I eat this on Shabbos? Is this kosher? Whatever your question is, do I have to put on tefillin in this situation? You need a quick answer, and Rav Aviner is there ready he's got his phone ready to answer you back. So his answers are great. He said, I'll just give you two of them. Does a flower vase require tefillah in a mikveh? Right? So he says, no, only utensil which comes in contact with food. Done. My favorite one is this one, civil war in the USA. A rabbi said that there will soon be civil war in the United States, and Jews should therefore make aliyah. Is this true? And Rav Aviner answers, we don't have prophets which can reveal the future to us, but it is correct that Jews should make aliyah. So it's very straightforward, kind of pithy things. Rav Aviner, a good friend of mine, Rabbi Yitzchak Blau, wrote a critique of Rav Aviner's book, which was then hotly debated itself in the critique. And his critique is that it's fine for Rav Aviner to do to have this platform, but what is not appropriate is for him to publish them in a book, because there is no opportunity to really learn. The medium is meant for quick response, but not meant for a sort of a book. Books should be constructed out of that which is perhaps more reasoned. But one of the pieces of the argument is that if we go back to Rabbi Soloveitchik and the idea that you learned Torah from your father, your mother, your bubby, your zaydi, and we go back to Rabbi Federgren, that you learned Torah directly by hearing it from a teacher, this is the most disembodied form of Torah. And this is, I think, where we have to keep our eye on the ball with all of these electronic media. Whether you're listening to YU Torah, whether you are reading Rabbi Shurlo, whether you are reading Rabbi Aviner, whether you're texting your Torah, you are disembodying it. And one of the things that can't happen when you learn from Rabbi Rosner over the internet is for Rabbi Rosner to show you the disappointment in his face when you show up late for class. I pick Rabbi Rosner as an example because I know when Rabbi Rosner used to be a Rebbe in one of the programs at YU, he used to leave class and wake kids up in their dorm room when they didn't come to shir. There is something about the relationship. Judaism, I believe, is a relational, is a system which is built on the human interaction. These platforms are fantastic for disseminating Torah, but what they may be missing, what may be the great cost of the proliferation of Torah in this way, which is obviously saving us right now. I'm on this platform, but what we're not getting in this room is that sense of camaraderie, the neuro signals that are part of being part of a community. That's what's missing for us. So in the middle of this issue, we have to make sure that our Torah does not become disembodied. And you can see maybe a little bit in these particular vignettes that Torah is becoming disembodied. There is some advantage to that. People might not feel comfortable asking their rabbi, my mother's a nudnik, how do I deal with her? People might, there are probably even more graphic questions. I didn't have time to comb through all of the questions that are in Rav Shurlo or Rav Aviner's collections, but I'm sure some of them are very, very sensitive. Things that you would be embarrassed to bring to Rabbi Rosner, just because people don't like the disapproval of the Rebbe. There is some advantage to that, but we have to keep our eye on the ball for that purpose. I want to thank everyone for staying till the bitter end, for being part of this, recapturing that sense of community in this difficult time. I want to thank all of our presenters, and especially for Rabbi Gabay for all of his hard work on this. And I want to remind everyone that tonight, last night was the 48th night in the counting of the Omer. And thank you all for participating, for staying with us and being a part of this fantastic event. You're getting extra points in my book for giving us 3 full hours. Rabbi Gabay, do you want to say?
Thank you, Rabbi.
Sure.
Thank you, everyone.
Brilliant.